Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Writers Drinking Whiskey, your literary happy hour, the show where one piece of shaky footage proves that not only do authors exist, but we really like nature walks. I am your host who has been filmed in bars across the world via shaky cell phone selfies, William R. Hincy, and I am delighted and honored today to have author Matt Pruitt with me. Matt, welcome to the bar.
Thank you so much for having me, William. Greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. And so I'll give the introduction here, but anyone that's familiar with the show may notice my background's changed a little. There's a little less bars, a little more Sasquatch, and I think a couple of dragon little things here, which may not play into today. Maybe they will. But you wrote the book. It's the Phenomenal Sasquatch, Seeking the Natural Origins of a Cultural Icon. You also host you co-hosted the Apes Among Us podcast. And the current one, you're the producer, editor of the Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo. And then you're a trained animal tracker. I think you also taught some tracking as well, if I remember the bio right. And I think I heard, because I first heard about you on a podcast. I want to make sure I give the podcast credits too. That was the Confessionals. And I think I also heard you were in a band at some point.
Yes, I've worn a lot of hats over the years, but yeah, I started out. I grew up playing music, and then did that semi-professionally through my late teens and early 20s, and then I joined a major label band for a few years, and that was just an absolute blast. And so it's funny, I don't get to talk about music as much as I would love to, because it's still a huge part of my life. I still write and play, and it's just funny these days. Most of the time, it's for stuff for the podcast that I produce and occasionally co-host. So there's a lot of funny like bumpers and jingles and theme songs and things like that. I don't know if any of your audience is familiar with the Animal Planet series, Finding Bigfoot, but I worked on that show, and all those cast members I knew for years before the show was in development. And two of them are two of my closest friends, and those are the two hosts. That's Cliff and Bobo. And so Bobo's a huge, larger-than-life character, if anyone's ever seen the show. And I always joke about being a child of the 90s and, that sort of era of music. Like, I've written a gazillion, heart on sleeve, confessional, quote unquote, sad bastard songs. But at this point, like, my most listened to compositions are about Bobo. You know what I mean? So the irony.
Right. Yeah. You never know where life's going to lead. It's just,
exactly
where you end up. Awesome. So I kind of like to start just to get a place for where you are in the world. So where are you, and where's the best place to get a coffee there?
Gotcha. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. And gosh, my favorite place, probably my favorite coffee shop that I've been to. There's one in Franklin, Tennessee, which is a little suburb of Nashville. It's about 15 miles south or so. And it's called the Frothy Monkey. And I really like that place. Franklin's a really cool little area. And so I go in there quite a bit. But my drink of choice for this time was my late day caffeine. So I drink a lot of coffee typically. So I am a coffee lover. But when I'm home, the first thing I do is make a pot and drink a pot and then start a second pot. So I don't really go to there. I take that back. There's another really cool one right down the road from me, not terribly far away, called Caliber Coffee that I really like too. But so I don't want to leave them out. Those two I would say my favorites.
Yeah, very good. I love Nashville. We did. My wife and I and two of our closest friends, oldest friends, went to Nashville, I think it was 2 years ago now, and spent almost a week there and just walked the city. I think we were in, was it Germantown? That might have been the little area. We were walking down to the main strip and everything, which was a nice little walk, but it was a nice walk to get around. So we loved it. I actually had a layover. We just went to Myrtle Beach and I had a layover in Nashville, the same group. So, and we're like, oh man, we should have made this layover a little longer and just gotten out and seen it. So
yeah, it's a fun town, and it's cool, like being a music lover, because there's so many great venues here. And so everyone who goes on tour makes a Nashville stop. So it's a nice place to be that everyone rolls through. And I've lived in, I grew up in North Georgia. I lived in Atlanta. I lived in Seattle. I lived in Oklahoma City. I lived in Columbia, South Carolina, a bunch of places. But yeah, this is a cool town. It's not too big, which is great. It still kind of feels like a smaller town, so to speak, in a lot of ways. And then a lot of my field research has always been oriented in the Southern Appalachian. So I'm very close. I go down to North Georgia and Western North Carolina quite often. So it's a good place to be for sure.
Very good. So then I wonder then if you can maybe tell us a little about your author journey, kind of what leading up through life, leading up to publication of the book.
Certainly. Well, I never had aspirations necessarily to write a book. I mean, here and there, I would have flights of fancy, I guess you could say. And I'm glad I didn't jump on those too much in the early days. You know, when I first got interested in the subject and started pursuing it in terms of trying to find other witnesses near where I grew up in North Georgia and uncovering a lot of historical data and things of that nature. In the beginning, I thought, oh, I should try to write a book about the history of sightings and observations, whether just in North Georgia or maybe more broadly in Southern Appalachia. And I still have notes and outlines that I drafted back then. And this would have been, you know, in the early to mid 2000s. And so I certainly didn't know enough at that time to have done anything that would have been worthwhile. It would have been probably pretty superficial. So I'm glad that project didn't get finished.
That's okay. That's everybody's first book. You know, like, you know, you get a bunch of notes, you just start throwing things, and you know, the smart ones don't end up writing it. People like me, we still write it, and it just sits around in the closet somewhere.
Well, it is that, you know, the Dunning-Kruger effect, so to speak, of like, you know, the less you know about something, the more confidence you have in the totality of that knowledge. And then, you know, the more you learn, the more you become exposed to where the gaps in your knowledge are. And I've heard it described or analogized as sort of like a territory too, is that, you know, if you've got a little bit of knowledge, you're touching a little bit of the unknown, but the broader that territory gets, the more of the unknown you're touching. And so when I was younger and had those ideas, oh, I'm going to write a book, I probably thought I had a commanding grasp of the thing enough to have done so. And I would have been completely wrong. But over the years of, you know, pursuing it, both, you know, as much a balance of, let's say, armchair research and field research as I can manage, because I try to be in the field as much as possible. But then obviously, you know, whatever you're doing in pursuit in the physical world, you know, that sort of like the participatory aspect of it has to be rested on a foundation like the propositional, so to speak. So through pursuing that for so long and interacting with so many people and sort of developing my own perspectives, again, standing on the shoulders of those who came before, but still developing my own perspectives and sort of articulating like, well, here's the phenomenon as I see it. I was very fortunate enough over all these years to meet so many people that are like, oh, you should think about writing a book. You know, you should commit this somehow so that it doesn't just live in these conversations. Or, you know, I've been speaking publicly about the subject since 2007. So I always felt like, well, that's kind of like a body of work. Somebody could go back and listen to those interviews or podcasts. But the idea became like more and more interesting to me and seemed like something I wanted to pursue. And so I really started writing in earnest in 2020. It was right before the pandemic happened. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll do this someday. And then the pandemic happened, we're locked down. And so it's like, okay, now I really don't have an excuse because I'm sort of homebound with this time, and I should use this time, you know, as productively as I can. And I really thought at that time too, I was like, oh, I'll get it done by this summer because it's all up here. I just have to get it out onto the page. And then summer of 2021 rolled around and like, oh, I'll be done by this summer. And then, so it took 3 years. I finally released it last summer of 2023. But so, yeah, the journey was just, you know, obsessively pursuing, you know, this question, you know, what is responsible for the Sasquatch phenomenon itself, and trying to get to the bottom of that and offering what I think is the most likely hypothesis or the most parsimonious hypothesis, and then trying to commit all that in writing in a way that I felt was an accurate representation of everything that I wanted to say, being really intimately familiar with everything that had been written before and saying, like, I don't want to just retread old ground. Now, obviously, I was trying to write something that would be, you know, one of my personal goals was like, well, very often people would ask me, you know, if I wanted to learn about this subject, what should I read? And of course, like I have my top 10, and within that, there's my top 5, and then the top 3 essentials. And so at least like you've got to read these 5 books to have what I think is a pretty thorough education. And so I thought, well, could I write the kind of thing where someone could only ever read one book and they'd come away with a pretty strong foundation, a pretty strong understanding, pretty thorough of the entirety of the subject. So some retreading is necessary there because you got to synthesize a lot of works to sort of lay out what's happened before. And I found that to be kind of challenging because obviously as writers, you know, I really don't consider myself a writer because I've only written this one thing, but
obviously you can't say that on the show. You have to be a writer on the show.
Oh, for sure. But, I really wanted to be dominated by mostly original thought or research, et cetera, but it still needed that foundation. And so trying to do all that justice without just repeating everything and without making that the bulk of everything, I found challenging. So that was part of why it took so long because as you know, I'm sure if you're writing something in the nonfiction space, you don't want to just make statements or propositions. And if people are like, well, hey, where's this coming from? Oh, well, you need to read these other things first, and then you can read my book and it'll make sense to you. Like, no, it needs to be complete, And so that's, the whole thing was very challenging. It made me I already had a tremendous amount of respect for writers and authors, but this definitely made me respect them a lot more because I did it all myself too, like every bit of it. Through the whole publication process, that didn't involve other people. And I had some conversations and was looking into those outlets, but it just kept being reiterated to me that like, no, I should do this all myself, I think, at least for this project.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's, what's funny is that is, I don't know, you said you don't consider yourself a writer, but that's almost everyone's first book. Is like you just have to like have that dogged determination and get through it. And once you realize what it is, there ends up being, I think, an influx for most people. It's like after you realize how to do it, it does get shorter for a while. And then you realize all the stuff like you had mentioned, like that like island in the ocean of ignorance, right? And as it grows, you just have more coastline that knows the ignorance. And then as that goes, then it gets a little longer again because now you're like, oh, I can do this. Oh, what am I doing? Like as you're, as you expand. So that's very, very familiar, and I think a lot of writers, I think a lot of people will appreciate it. So thank you for that. So you get the book done, and I also appreciate too, just this nonfiction is its own thing, right? Because you can't like I typically write fiction, so it has to be plausible to the world I'm creating, but I don't have to like worry about, oh no, I've completely misspoke on here, or this isn't factual, because it's all not factual, right? So that can be hard. So that sounds amazing. So then I wonder, then maybe we can just switch over the phenomenon in general. So for people, because I'm guessing a lot of the viewers here won't have intimate knowledge of the phenomenon. So I wonder if you could give us kind of an overview, just kind of set the stage for, because I'm sure people have heard of Sasquatch, right? You can't watch TV without him like eating a Slim Jim or something, right? he's out there. It's a phenomenon. I say she's out there. It's its own phenomenon. But maybe you can kind of give us a stage setting for those folks that really don't know the subject very well.
Oh, certainly. That's why I try to sort of lay out in the introduction to the book in a nutshell, was to say that if we're looking at it as a phenomenon, which I think is the proper framing, hence the title of the book, et cetera, is that we could at least say that for as long as we can look back in history, people have claimed to have seen and encountered these sorts of creatures. People make these claims that they observed or in some other way experienced having encountered what appears, what we might infer to be some sort of like large non-human ape. They're pretty consistently described as significantly larger than a human. They have other physical differences. They seem to have some sort of like pointed or peaked head that would be suggestive of a sagittal crest. They don't have any visible constriction at the neck. They have very, very broad shoulders, disproportionately broader than a human's would be, disproportionately longer arms, et cetera. And so people are describing something that you couldn't just clearly attribute to misidentified bears, let alone like deer or elk or moose or something of that nature. And the descriptions are consistent enough that it's not easily, relegated to, oh, well, these are just all fabrications, or they're all hallucinations or lies. And then beyond the claims, then you do have this host of physical items, physical elements that are interpreted as or touted as evidence that are associated with the claims. So people have probably seen many images of footprints or casts of footprints and things of this nature. And so I would say there's clearly some sort of phenomenon going on in that, according to the claimants, it has an influence on them. They were left very often shaken, terrified, left in awe, whatever the case may be. Their paradigm shifted after this experience, and it seems to have some effect on the environment, in the form of this, what we might interpret as trace evidence. And so the question is, okay, well, in the simplest terms, what could be responsible for this phenomenon? And so the way that I frame it in the book is if we stick to the realm of the known, without invoking some other unknown, like, oh, well, they're apparitions, or they're interdimensional beings, or they're extraterrestrials, or metaphysical, whatever the case may be. It's like, well, no, what people describe seems to be some sort of animal, and it seems to be covered in hair, and the female representatives of the species have mammary glands, according to claimants, and so it's some sort of mammal. And then we look at the physical descriptions of this mammal. Well, they have the most in common with apes, so it doesn't seem to be some sort of novel bear or novel species of some other sort, like an ungulate. And so the question is, okay, well, either, could there be a living animal species that fits that description, that's responsible for at least some of these claims and some of this trace evidence? Or in lieu of that, the other most likely solution would be, could it be a psychological phenomenon? Either one that manifests itself involuntarily, like a hallucination or a delusion or something of that nature, or something that is voluntary, like something that people generate, from their imaginations out of nothing and offer deceptively as truth. And then the trace evidence would be an extension of that, almost like an artistic representation, that people craft to represent this psychological phenomenon. And the case that I try to put forth in the book is that I think, all things considered, when we look at every element of the subject from the bottom up, historically speaking, statistically speaking, in terms of what claimants describe, where these claims happen, in geographically speaking, et cetera, that I think the biological hypothesis, the idea that there is a species of animals that fits this description, I actually think that's a simpler and therefore more likely solution to the question than that it's all solely psychological. Now, again, that comes along with a host of unanswered questions too, like, well, where are the bones or remains or the sort of irrefutable physical proof? While there is a mountain of evidence that is subjective and it requires interpretation that would support this idea, there's no proof. Similarly, there's no proof of the psychological hypothesis at this point either. But that's the way that I try to approach it through my own study, through my own research, and then also in the book, is that it's an undeniable fact that people have made these claims for as long as they've been occupying North America, at least in terms of the written word. And it seems to be that there are indigenous oral traditions and artistic representations that are much older that might depict these same sort of ape-like creatures. And then the question is like, well, you take all these facts in hand and you try to think, well, what's the causal agent behind the existence of these facts? Either there's an animal or there's something really interesting about the human mind that seems to be relegated to these certain places. And it's a genuine mystery. I know a lot of people write it off. Obviously, I've encountered that many times over the last 20 years of pursuing it. But one of the goals of the book was to try to show, because no one had ever synthesized almost everything into a single work that I had seen. And so one of the takeaways that I'm really happy with is that so many people, normies, let's say, people that are not already Sasquatch researchers or proponents or enthusiasts, just the average person, a lot of people have gotten back to me and they said, I had no idea there was so much to this. I'm like, yeah, exactly. And hopefully it delivers that in a single book rather than, again, having to say, well, read these 10 books and then you'll understand.
It's like the Marvel stuff nowadays, right? It used to be, you go watch a movie. My son got really into him when he was around 5. We'd watch them. And then they kind of strung together to Endgame or whatever. And that was fine, though. They're mostly standalone kind of movies. But now it's like, you need to watch this series on Disney Plus and this. And it's like, now we've all lost interest because we're like, I don't have time. So like, I just want to go watch one movie that's self-contained. So I think that's great. That's going to end up being families know what's coming on Christmas, because everyone always thinks like I'm just kooky. And I'm like, you don't understand how much information there is on it. And, I'm sure you've synchronized it much better than I ever would. But I wondered, as you were saying that though, so is it strictly like a North American phenomenon, or does it expand, across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets very interesting, at least for me. And it's something I've had to clarify and elucidate many times over the last 20 years, in that it depends on how we frame our categories, or at least our definitions. And so if you're looking strictly at characters that exist in moral tales, folklore, fables, mythology, oral traditions, etc., you could say that there's a category that we might refer to as like the archetypal wild man. And so, of course, there are these archetypal wild man characters in folkloric representations around the world. And you might invoke something like the faun, the satyr, centaur, the minotaur, on and on and on, like variations of this particular, wild human-like or human animal sort of hybrid, for lack of a better word, in these stories. Mm-hmm. I sort of delineate that from then, okay, well, let's look at the claims that people make to have encountered these things contemporary. So they're not characters. Those things that are represented in those stories very often are singular characters, almost like a Hercules or a Zeus, or to use, we'll invoke Marvel again, and like the Hulk or Iron Man or something like that. Right. But then around the world, in certain parts of the world, you do have claims with a very long history, and oftentimes supported by physical evidence, of the existence of what seems to be, or, the claims and evidence suggest the existence of some sort of as yet unrecognized ape species. And those tend to be differentiated. If we looked at just physical structure, for example, most of that occurs in Asia, and then a little bit down into Australia. And so in Asia, there are similar claims related to similar forms. Again, like significantly larger than a human, habitually upright, walking on two legs. They have a lot of the same behaviors, purportedly in the same context. And so in China, the most common term is the Ye Rin. Then you move into Bhutan, it's the Migoi. There's the Mande Barung of India. You see this sort of like pan-Pacific distribution of these certain parts of Asia across the Bering Strait into North America. Then you go further into different parts of Asia. There's another sort of mystery ape or mystery hominin that's in some places referred to as the Almas, in other places the Almasti. Then you get into the Hindu Kush region, sort of the border of Afghanistan, Pakistan. They call it the Barmanu. And all of those descriptions tend to be something much more man-like in size and shape. And so 5.5 feet tall on average, narrower shoulders, shorter arms. There is a visible constriction at the neck. They're built more like something akin to a human ancestor, or a primitive form of something within our genus, let's say. Then you go further into certain parts of Southeast Asia, and there's a smaller, more diminutive ape-like creature reported, and that tends to be a lot in Indonesia, in certain like island regions of Indonesia, variously called things. The most popular name is the orang pendek. And so there is I would say, like, you have this broad folkloric category of archetypal wild man that's represented in various imagistic ways, various symbolic ways, and has a certain set of motifs associated with it. Then you have mystery apes, and you can fractionate those out. But the problem is, because Bigfoot or Sasquatch is so popular, oftentimes people will refer to the orang pendek as like the Indonesian Sasquatch, or they'll refer to the Almas as the Russian Sasquatch, or the Mongolian Sasquatch, or the Sasquatch of the Caucasus Mountains as you move further inland, essentially. And really, when you break down the descriptions, you realize, like, no, what people are describing are various different, if there are animals, but even if we treat them as if they're representing animals, they're wildly different. And so people have taken exception to the fact that I say, well, Sasquatch is not a worldwide phenomenon. So it's not necessarily that these giant ape forms are restricted to North America, but they're mostly restricted to North America and very specific parts of Asia. And so why that's fascinating to me is that, first of all, if it were solely psychological, and the fact that it is so prevalent in certain places, like, well, you could make a lot of different arguments. Like, okay, well, it's something that's inborn and inherited, baked in, let's say. Something akin to like the idea of archetypes, something that exists within our collective unconscious, or, a better way to think of it is like the inherited sort of base layer platform operating system of the human psyche. It's like, well, if that's the case, then why aren't they worldwide? Why aren't they seen all around the planet? Oh, well, it has to be context specific. You tend to see that these sightings really only occur in heavily forested areas, very rugged and often mountainous. It's like, okay, well then why isn't there a history of similar claims in Scandinavia or, in the Bavarian Alps or in the Carpathian Mountains or in Korea or these various other places that are frequented by humans that are heavily forested, have rugged mountains. Very often, many of these places have deer and elk and brown bears. And so there's plenty of the same sort of fauna that exists in North America, not here or not there rather. So I find that interesting that it does seem to be geographically restricted. And the fact that, oh, well, it's just an American idea. Okay, well, Americans travel. So why don't Americans have this same image, if it's involuntarily produced, why don't they have it triggered when they're traveling overseas? And by the way, there's plenty of overseas tourists who come to North America and claim to have encountered Sasquatches in these places, like certain national parks or other public lands, et cetera. And so the way that I would differentiate that would be to say, like the idea of the predator that lurks in the bush, this sort of archetypal idea is worldwide. Big cats, you could say, are sort of a worldwide phenomenon, but the tiger is not a worldwide phenomenon. Because a tiger is not a leopard, is not a jaguar, is not a cougar, on and on. So I would differentiate between these different mystery apes the same way that, like, yes, all over the world there are characters in stories that have these sort of wild man-esque qualities. Beyond that, you do have populations over long stretches of time that claim to have seen certain forms of mystery apes, but they're not all Sasquatch-like. They're not all that big, massive, hulking sort of form. So I still don't see the Sasquatch phenomenon as a worldwide or global phenomenon, nor do I even think the mystery ape phenomenon, because once again, I can name many forested mountainous regions across the planet for which there's no history of claims and there's no body of evidence of any sort of mystery ape. So it seems to me that it's more likely that there is an external, like an exogenous thing going on rather than it being entirely internal, entirely restricted to the inner realm of the human mind, so to speak. So hopefully that, I know I can get long-winded, so hopefully that answers your question.
No worries. So is the book then, is it more about the Sasquatch type, the North America down to like Asia, like you mentioned, or does it cover the other species, for lack of a better word, the other kind of types of mystery apes?
No, I kept it pretty constrained to North America.
Okay.
Because that's what I have the most familiarity with. And that's where the bulk of the research and aggregation of that data has been done. It hasn't been done to the same degree in the other parts of the world. There are excellent books. There's a great book about what seems to be a similar form in Australia that is called the Yowie there. And there's a great book that came out in 2006 by Tony Healy and Paul Cropper called The Yowie, and that's a fascinating read. And then there's been some books written by Russian researchers, mostly in like the mid to late 20th century, about this sort of almosti, the more man-like forms that are fascinating to read. But just the bulk of information over here, because researchers were so dogged, especially in the mid 20th century, and aggregating reports, aggregating data. There's just more to analyze in North America. And so it's a little bit, but man, I would love to expand that. And that's one of the plans. Once I got in the habit of writing on a daily basis for this book, even when I finished it and put it out, I've tried to stay in that habit, but without as much of a clear, concise outline, just sort of like, okay, well, whatever I'm sort of wrestling with at this moment and really trying to work through, like, that's what I'm going to be writing about and studying. And then things will emerge where like, oh, these ideas are linked. And so maybe at some point I could have multiple other book projects and like, oh, I've already done the bulk of the writing, but that is the sort of worldwide, a broader view of some of the more, especially the Asian mystery apes, I think would be a fun project.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then Indonesia, you mentioned it's smaller. Didn't they just find, I shouldn't say just find, I think it was a few years ago, but they found skeleton. They called it like the Hobbit skeleton, right? Was that also in that area? Or is that?
Well, that's a fascinating thing, is the discovery of, it was on the island of Flores, and so it was called Homo floresiensis. And that was an area that had a long history of claims and a folkloric history too, of what was referred to as the Ibu Gogo, which were these small, diminutive, man-like, non-human primates. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting that, oh, wow, well, we discovered this corresponding fossil of such a creature, which should really make people pause. And it did make a few notable people pause. I mean, there was the Henry Gee, I think he was the editor of Nature, the scientific journal Nature. I hope I'm getting that right. I think it was Nature and not another journal, but he made this kind of proclamation that a lot of people were inspired by, people that had been pursuing the sort of mystery ape phenomenon when Homo floresiensis was discovered. And he had a pretty strong recognition that this is an awfully lot like the things that people have claimed to have encountered there for a very long time. And he said, maybe it's time for cryptozoology to come in from the cold.
Right.
And maybe
Yeah.
we should take these sorts of claims seriously. And then in the relevant parts of Asia, you have, the largest ape that ever lived that is represented in our fossil record, coinciding with, the same places that give rise to the lore, let's say, of the Yeti, the Migoi, the Yeren, et cetera. And the lore predates the discovery of these fossils of this massive ape genus called Gigantopithecus. And so that's true in most of these places where there are mystery ape claims and, these fossil discoveries that are very close to the descriptions of such claims. It's true everywhere with the exception of North America. We've never unearthed any bones or fossils of something approximating a non-human ape, something a very large ape-like form here in North America. But everywhere else, like I said, I find that really interesting and makes it harder to dismiss as simply a psychological phenomenon. It could at least be the case that our ancestors observed and encountered these things and then encoded those experiences in narratives, in stories and oral tradition, and that gets passed down. And so some of what's around today are the sort of vestigial memory, so to speak, cultural memory from those retellings. But it's obviously not as easy to dismiss when you're face to face with witnesses and claimants, over and over again, who say, I saw one yesterday, or whatever the case may be.
Right. Well, what's interesting about that is if it was just kind of memory being passed down, well, most of, 60% of Americans, Europeans, that wouldn't have been here to have it passed down from those earlier times. Or, maybe if you were from, like China region or, East Asia, it's not just them seeing it, right? So there wouldn't be any reason for, my family was like Italy and Ireland and to have this memory in there when there's no, unless you tell me otherwise, there's no Sasquatch or wild man. I've never heard of any wild man encounters in little old Ireland, right? So it's like, why are Irish people seeing it then if it was just that? So awesome. Thanks for that. Have you ever encountered a Sasquatch?
I've had multiple experiences that were consistent with what other people describe. I've never had a visual experience. So, there's been a couple of times where I had encounters, let's say, or experiences that did have a visual component, but, to make long stories very brief, like one of them was basically a silhouette at night. It was associated with a lot of other sounds that we heard and tracks. So it's pretty compelling for me. And then the second one was through a thermal imager, and it was only a portion of some living thing, because I've used thermal imagers in the fields for, almost 20 years. It's been since about 2006. So, but I can never see more than portions of this thing at a time. And so the entire time I was still wondering, like, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? And so no identifying sort of like field marks. So without having seen one, like, I can't say that I know, when people will ask me, like, what do you believe? It's like, well, I believe that the biological hypothesis is the simplest one. I believe that that's the most likely one. Like, I'm convinced that there's a biological reality, but I could be wrong and I don't know. And so despite hearing these sort of characteristic vocalizations that can't be attributed to other North American fauna, or in some cases, it can't be attributed to any animal anywhere in the world, but they seem to not be generated by people. or experiencing projectiles, having rocks thrown at you. I've experienced that a number of times, which gets pretty unnerving, and I've seen
Sure.
people go through that. I mean, there was a site where we spent a lot of time in the U.S. Interior Highlands there, the Ouachita Mountains. And, we had a number of structures there, one of which was a pretty large, pretty tall, basically almost like a carport that you could get. But it's basically like a one-walled thing with a pitched roof, and all the other walls are open. And that was sort of like our base camp shelter where we could store things under there. And if the bottom dropped out, there's this big surface for it to be dry. And it's in this flat valley floor. The slopes are pretty easy slopes. They're not steep. There's no cliffs. And, we'd had activity. The reason I started going down there is because I was working with a number of researchers that was experiencing activity down there. And I was down there and there was a newer person, kind of a neophyte to the whole subject and a bit on the fence. And so, we were tidying camp, and I put up a ladder and got on the roof of that thing and swept off, whatever leaves and debris had fallen. And we're sitting in camp and talking, and then bam, and there's a loud impact on the roof, and told the new, we'll go take a look, and he puts the ladder up and looks, and there's a rock. And this roof is 14 feet off the ground.
Right.
And so to see his sort of paradigm of like, how did that get here? It's like, well, you tell me. It didn't jump, off the ground, and there's nothing above it for it to have fallen off of a cliff or something. So experiences like that, where
sure
you're hearing things or encountering things that cannot just be readily, oh, that's a deer, that's a bear, that's another person. But also the frustration of having spent, so much time. I mean, because I've done field research all over North America. I did it full time for 1 year. And in that 1 year, I spent over 200 days and nights in the field, not consecutively. So it'd be like 3 to 5 days at a time, and then come out and recharge batteries and swap SD cards and all that stuff. But so I've never seen one. So it's very frustrating because I would like to have what so many witnesses or claimants have told me is like that gnosis, that, like, I know what I saw. I don't care what anyone thinks. I know they exist. But I also find it really interesting that I haven't seen one, because that's, the skeptical or even sometimes like the cynical rebuttal is like, oh, well, this is all, first of all, people will think like, oh, well, everybody's lying. And it's like, okay, well, I don't think everybody is lying. Like, that's a little too far, Okay, well, some of these people are just crazy or delusional. And it's like, okay, well, I don't think they all are. But at least that almost is more charitable, because that's at least saying that people believe that they've had such an experience, or believe, or at least like phenomenologically have seen such a thing. And I'll say, okay, well, why do you think that is? Because I can produce for you many claimants who, in every other aspect of their life, they're basically unimpeachable. And some of these are people with positions of authority or stellar careers, or positions of great responsibility, medical professionals, law enforcement professionals. And they'll say like, oh, well, it's a wish fulfillment. They wanted it. They saw what they wanted to see. And I was like, if it was a wish fulfillment, I would have seen 100 of them by now, because nobody has wished harder than I have. So I find that part of it interesting, that like, if there is just some psychological thing, apparently I don't have it, because it should have manifested itself to me, which is frustrating, but nonetheless, an interesting pursuit,
Yeah, for sure. I wonder that with the, you mentioned the cast, and I'm sure everyone is probably aware they've seen those giant footprint casts. And then, I'm sure sometimes people like hoax them. I'm sure there are some stories of dudes out there with shoes, because dudes do weird things generally, so, but I wonder why you find them so compelling, and why you would think some of them aren't, just guys with shoes on.
Certainly. Well, the ones that are the most compelling, people have been documenting footprints for a long time. I mean, even with the early non-natives who came over. I mean, there are descriptions and representations in indigenous oral traditions and artistic representations, but they are sort of artistically represented. So they're not necessarily like one-to-one facsimiles of what they observed in the field, let's say. Then when you have non-natives coming over, there are descriptions of these tracks. And then with the advent of cameras, people photographed them, and then they began to cast them to have like a three-dimensional sort of record. So I think the further you go back in time, the more interesting it is, because obviously if there is something primary going on, it's easy to replicate, the primary thing. And so even if there were real tracks, if we could establish that, well, then of course anyone could see those, whether, in a book or a documentary, and then just replicate that in the field. Most of the people who do that too are just pranksters. They're just people out for a laugh. So hoaxes have occurred in hoax tracks, but it's not like they're these malicious people trying to, destroy the endeavor. Most of the time, it's just pranksters. Mm-hmm. So, but the further you go back in time, the less of that there is, because they're not as widely distributed. The photographs weren't widely distributed. The descriptions of them weren't widely distributed. They might be restricted to a few Sasquatch books, that were written in the early 60s or into the 70s that were basically self-published. And maybe a few of them had wider publication, but it wasn't like they were being devoured by the general public. And what's interesting among those that emerged, first of all, there are trackways, let's say, where there are multiple tracks that can be followed for a significant distance. So it wasn't like it just crossed a road, like perpendicular to the road, and it only left one or two tracks in the dirt road. Sometimes, there's a line of tracks, and you can see things like the dynamic movement of toes, where toes splay and spread and then sometimes curl as they're, that prehensile aspect of the foot that's gripping to gain purchase to propel the animal forward. Where you think, well, if this was a fixed object, you would have to have a different fixed object for every single impression, which is not impossible. It could be done, but it makes it less likely. But I think the most compelling thing about the footprints is the inferred morphology that's been arrived at by certain anthropologists and anatomists like Dr. Grover Krantz or the sort of the most, I think, prolific and the person I respect the most in the contemporary academic world that's looked at the Sasquatch is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. And he's an anatomist and an anthropologist, and his specialty is in primate locomotion, and especially bipedal locomotion. So the way that we walk on two legs and then human ancestors, et cetera. And there are features evident, because a Sasquatch track superficially looks like a big person's track in that they're roughly the same shape and dimensions, proportions rather, and that they have 5 toes that are aligned. Because the other great apes, because they're arboreal and they spend a lot of time in trees, their big toe, the hallux, is still very divergent. And so it juts out laterally, almost like a thumb does. Whereas, as you become more terrestrial and bipedal, it's more advantageous that aligns with the other toes, that particular digit. But that's sort of where the similarities end. Humans are one of the hallmarks of our foot anatomy is this fixed longitudinal arch. That does not seem to be present at all in the Sasquatch feet. They're much flatter, so without the arch. And interestingly, the point of flexion or pivot that occurs that we would the tracks suggest that this occurs is more in the mid part of the foot, the midline. And so the consequence of that as it interacts, they call it like a mid-tarsal hinge or metatarsal hinge. And it's referred to as a mid-tarsal break because it's a break in these two planes of action within the foot. So it's interesting to see tracks from the 1950s and the 1960s that display this sort of dynamic movement as the animal's moving along and the foot presses onto the ground and then the heel lifts and all the push off comes from the forepart, the entire like front half of the foot. Whereas our foot, the way it bends, you can bend your foot at the ball, but you can't raise just your heel and leave the whole front half of your foot in contact with the ground. So it suggests a very different structure, different morphology. And not a lot of people had picked up on that at the time, but they were cast and they were photographed. And so you can see this evident in a number of Sasquatch tracks from the mid 20th century. And it's only subsequently later, as we unearth fossils of human ancestors, like some of the Australopithecines or other, pre-human apes, that you see that actually that's a crucial feature for ape feet, and especially during the evolutionary history of bipedalism. And that all things considered, if you were to posit the existence of a large non-human ape that was habitually bipedal, you would expect it to retain that feature from our ancestors, and it would appear at a certain place. And so you'd have to think, well, is that some happy accident that occurs in these tracks prior to, we hadn't even unearthed the fossils that would give us that clue about this particular feature.
Mhm.
So would it just be the fact that some hoaxer anticipated this discovery and anticipated decades later future understanding?
Right.
And in lieu of that, is it just some artifact of wearing stompers? Now, a stomper is most fake tracks were made by stompers, some flat fixed object that, you wear like a shoe and that leaves that impression. So the hoaxers of the 50s and 60s usually used carved wooden stompers, and that's a flat fixed plane. I mean, it doesn't flex in the center, it's not capable of spreading its toes or curling its toes. And so a flat stomper has certain telltale signs. Very often the hoaxer, in order to give the impression of greater weight, will rock the stomper back and forth to push it in the ground, and that leaves a certain sort of impression in the ground. Or because it is flat and fixed, when the foot lifts up, it's not like your heel can just, the entire stomper has to move. And so there tends to be a much deeper dig in at the toes, because there comes a point where all your weight is being transferred to that specific point. And that's just absent in a number of these tracks. And again, there's these other morphological suggestions, but especially the presence of that midfoot flexibility, where it occurs in time in relationship to the discovery of that in other non-human apes from the fossil record. It's like, that's, Dr. Meldrum refers to it as the smoking gun. And I think I'd have to agree with him on that. It's like, that's a hard one to write off as just a happy accident,
Right. Is there ever any cast where like they've stepped on a rock or something, and you see like they've stepped on that Lego, and you see where they where the toes bend around it, and then they whimper off because stepping on Lego sucks?
Absolutely. Well, there's I cite one really fascinating case in the book, in the chapter devoted to evidence in the section about footprints, it was from the Blue Mountains, but I'm trying to remember if it's on the Oregon side or the Washington side. But, a number of people analyzed it, including Dr. Krantz that I mentioned, who was a professor of anthropology. But a woman named Susan Cashel wrote a great paper about that particular track, because of this track line, one of the tracks, the thing stepped right onto a rock, and it seems like the soft tissues of the foot just conformed around the rock. And so she wrote a paper about what she would infer about the adipose tissue, the fatty tissue that creates the sole pad, or that, similar to like the sole pads of dogs or a bear's paw or something of that nature. And it's a fascinating read and a fascinating paper. And it did seem to be something living and dynamic, and not just a hard wooden flat stomper. And then Cliff Barrickman, again, who was on Finding Bigfoot and do the podcast with, has either himself cast or has received a cast of another example where it stepped right on a rock and seemed to conform to it, the same way that, again, our foot, like you said, in a Lego, it's just that we've got very weak pads because we wear cushy shoes with soles in them. But, human populations that are habitually unshod, that never wear shoes, you should see images. They're really fascinating, because obviously they develop great thick calluses, and so they're used to navigating that world, but also their toes are much more splayed. The natural state of the human foot is a much more splayed toe, and our toes take that shape because they're constantly crammed into a toe box in a shoe. And they that's one of the telltale signs too, when people, because very often people find barefoot human tracks and they think that it's a Sasquatch track. And I'm like, well, yeah, but look, it's only like 8 inches long. And they're like, oh, but it could be a juvenile Sasquatch. And like, all right, well, let's look at a few things. There's a clear arch, you can see the ball of the foot and the longitudinal arch. Like, that's probably a person. But another thing you'll notice is that people that wear shoes for the majority of their lives, their pinky toe curls inward. So you'll see that in barefoot tracks, that like, instead of being all firmly impressed like that, the small toe is turned inward towards the side. And so you don't see that in these Sasquatch tracks. So there are all these subtle differences of purported Sasquatch tracks beyond just the size, because, the Sasquatch tracks are typically anywhere from like 14.5 to 16.5 inches long, and they're very broad as well. So they're well outside of the average human range. But other than size alone, there are little subtle differences for sure.
Has there ever been, and I don't know if the toes even have them, but I'm thinking like fingers, how we have fingerprints, right? Is there like toe prints? Has there ever been any evidence of that?
Well, that's an interesting thing too, is that there are a number of tracks that show these ridges that some experts have interpreted as dermal ridges or dermatoglyphics, fingerprints, essentially ridge detail. And it's a really difficult thing to get to the bottom of. And I try to do that in this chapter in the book, is that some of the casts have similar features right around the edges of the foot, almost like you would expect around, if you were habitually barefoot, you would, again, you develop thick calluses as you're interacting with rough substrate. You could easily see that it'd be easy to sort of wear down or rub off. I mean, we've seen people my fingers are that way from playing guitar for 30 years. You know what I mean? Like there's really no dermal ridges on my left-hand fingertips.
Right.
So people thought, oh, well, that would make sense that there would be less of this skin ridge detail on the actual flat surface of the foot, but on the sole pad that sort of underhangs, you might see that. But interestingly, in some of those cases, the substrate that they were cast in was a really dry, silty sort of sand/dirt. And so when people did tests trying to replicate these conditions at home with similarly dry sand or dirt, they found that it was so dry and porous that it would wick the water out of the plaster. And so what would happen is, as the plaster was curing, it would cure in these little waves. It would harden and then roll over and harden and roll over and harden. And so those artifacts from just the casting process, in some cases, are indistinguishable from the ridge detail on the edge of some of these footprints. So some of the things that have previously been interpreted as dermatoglyphics, I think, have been demonstrated to probably is more likely that they're casting artifacts. Now, it still could be a real track of a real living animal. It's just that that component of it has been misinterpreted. Whereas there are other tracks where there are these sort of consistent dermatoglyphics within the toes. One really interesting one in particular that was looked at by a fingerprint expert named Jimmy Chilcutt, who saw interpreted in it what seemed to be scar tissue, and the way that the ridges curled around the scar as it healed, in the same way that your ridges would, if you were to lacerate your hand and that healed, there's this sort of curling that occurs with they don't just line back up perfectly. So yes, there are some instances what really seem strongly to be dermal ridges. Some of the ones that Krantz wrote about, he interviewed a whole host of various latent fingerprint experts, a lot of people who worked in law enforcement or, federal law enforcement, even in some cases, who all said, like, these look legitimate to us, and they'd seem to be non-human. Because you'd think, well, one easy way you could fake that is you just press the fake stomper in the ground, and then you go with your fingertips and you inlay your own fingers. Right. And so these guys were looking for that to see if someone had introduced the dermal ridge after, faking these tracks, and they came to the conclusion that wasn't the case. So, but, in most instances, you have to think, like, you'd have to have a substrate that's fine enough, like the grains are fine enough to fit in between your ridges. So, if you're on, a rocky beach or a beach of like very dense coarse sand, you can leave a clean handprint, but there's the material, the medium isn't enough to record that detail. And even of those that are, you'd have to mix your plaster finely enough to fill in those details, which could be easily lost too, because very often, let's say if you had tracks on a dirt road, once again, like a dirty, silty sort of substance, where you pour plaster in there, just the weight of that heavy liquid hitting the ground might be enough. And so there's different methods that you can use. They call it, one is splatter casting, where you take the plaster itself and you dip your fingers in it and you just lightly splatter it until you have basically an eggshell thin layer in the whole track. And that's enough to capture all that fine detail without displacing anything or erasing anything, and then you pour the rest in on that. So again, long-winded, I'm sorry. So there are a few examples of that.
No worries. Yeah,
they're not as prominent, and it's mostly because the kind of places where these things live, that there's just not that kind of substrate that would record that fine detail.
What about the rocks? Have you guys ever dusted a rock for like prints? I think my wife likes to watch CSI like shows when she goes to bed, so I'm just thinking of all these like murder investigations. But have you ever dusted, or has that ever been?
I have not. People have collected what they thought were handprints or fingerprints from surfaces, usually like vehicles, glass doors, things like that, where supposedly like, they approach a homestead or a cabin or something. If someone lives in the right area, they're in the right habitat, and they claim that, one came in and looked in the window. So there's some really interesting things going on there. And a number of those handprints have been documented. One of which was by the latent fingerprint examiner, Jimmy Chilcutt. That was actually from the roof of basically a junk or abandoned car at a place in Oklahoma, where this guy had a fairly close encounter near his home, or at his home, basically. And he spooked it, and it ran off. And, this is sort of a impoverished area, so to speak, to be kind. It's a beautiful area, but, there's a lot of junk cars and dead appliances and things like that lying around. And so this thing bolted and basically stepped over a dead lawnmower that was sitting there between two junk cars. And when it did, it put its hand on the roof of this car and kept to like steady itself as it stepped over this lawnmower. And so a friend of mine, I cite him in the book. He went down there with other investigators. This was in the early 2000s. And lo and behold, there was this massive handprint on the roof of this car. And it was like, how are we going to document this? And Chilcutt was like, I don't know if I can get up there. You guys should try to cover it, if it's going to rain or whatever. So because the car was junk and abandoned, they got the guy's permission. They just took a saw and cut the roof out so they could take the handprint home with them.
Right.
So there's examples like that. Recently, there's an amazing guy, a guy named Doug Hychek, who's just a genius of a guy in terms of his approach to, he's sort of a wildlife oriented guy. So he's done a lot of Sasquatch related things, but mostly I would call him a wildlife researcher, but he's sort of a documentarian / producer. He produced several cool documentaries about the Sasquatch. He produced the first ongoing television series about the Sasquatch called Mysterious Encounters. I don't know if you ever saw Monster Quest. He was the producer of Monster Quest.
Oh, okay. Very cool.
Yeah, he's done a lot of very cool things. And so he's been networking with a lot of different researchers and then witnesses too, trying to collect whatever's left of these things and see that, because we all have these oils that our skin produces, and, there's a different chemical composition per each species, like our oil production is different than a gorilla or a chimp or a orang, our other closest living relatives. And so he thinks that he might be able to line up labs who can, basically scrape whatever's left of these handprints, because it's more than just dust. I mean, like something was deposited there that collected dust, and it seems to be some kind of skin oil. And he thinks that they might be able to take that apart at a molecular level, I guess, and see what the chemical composition is, and somehow demonstrate that it is not human and it is not some known animal, but it is biological in origin. So people are trying to make progress on those fronts for sure.
That's interesting. Have they ever done any other body parts besides the hands and feet, like any other cast of them laying down somewhere? Or
there's one very prominent one that was obtained in Washington near Mount St. Helens in, I think it was the year 2000 or somewhere in the early 2000s, but I'm pretty sure it was 2000, near a place called Skookum Meadows. And so it got the name the Skookum Cast. And it seems to be, it's people debate over the interpretation of it, but a number of, to me, very relevant experts, Jeff Meldrum, Grover Krantz, but then there was a guy named Darius Swindler, who was an anatomist, but also a primate researcher, primatologist. I think he wrote the Gross Atlas, or the Atlas of Gross Primate Anatomy. I mean, so like the book about primate anatomy. He was always pretty derisive of Sasquatch believers and of the subject. And, he was a talking head for quite a while in the media because of his expertise. They would come to him and like, Dr. Swindler, what do you think of all this? And, these stories, but he was asked to examine the Skookum Cast. And so what it appeared to be, and I outline it in the book, but, other people have gone to greater lengths to discuss it. I hope there will be a publication about it at some point, because no one's ever really devoted a book to that, or even an academic paper to that. But it seemed like this thing laid down on its side, propped up by its sort of elbow, laid flat, and was accessing a bait pile that was mostly fruit that was left out for it. And that in that position, moving around, dug its heels in a few different places. And that's the way that a lot of the primate experts interpreted it, including Swindler. That was the thing that knocked Swindler off the fence. And in fact, I'm not speaking out of turn here. I wasn't there, but Doug Hychek has told it many times, because he filmed this, was filming it for a documentary. And he said Dr. Swindler cried. He was so overwhelmed, and he said, like, how have we missed this for all this time? And it was right there in my face, all these stories, all this evidence, and I didn't believe it. And he said, what I'm seeing here, he said, this looks to me like the direct descendant of Gigantopithecus, that this is something. And there were two things that compelled him the most. The primary one was the places where what they interpreted as a heel dug in, there was a very thick, very well-pronounced Achilles tendon. And based on the footprints that had been collected decades before, like I said, with that midfoot flexibility, it seemed to be the case that they had an elongated heel. So if you're looking just at the total length of the foot, where the shin would sort of terminate in the foot is more towards the center. Superficially, that's because the heel is so much more elongated to accommodate all that size and mass. And that's evident in this Achilles tendon impression, is that, there's this big pronounced hollow between the Achilles tendon and the actual, like the shin itself, the bone, where it diverges away to wrap around that heel. That really moved him. There was one particular person. It's funny because things get so mythologized for good or bad. There's a lot of Bigfoot myths that are positive that I have to dispel, where people will say something like, oh, well, they proved that piece of footage, that thing was 7.5 feet tall. It's like, actually, no, that's a myth. That was never established. But it's a positive myth because people think that, oh, well, that's too tall for a person, so it had to be a Sasquatch. And so and then there are negative myths like, oh, well, so-and-so confessed on their deathbed that was a hoax, which is like, no, that never happened. That's sort of a wives' tale. So in this case, there's this myth that like scientific experts interpreted it or proved that it was an elk lay, where an elk had laid down, because it's the Northwest. It's full of elk. There's all sorts of elk wandering around up there. But in reality, there was one particular person who put that in writing, and I think he was a geologist primarily, so not a biologist. But although he might have studied certain like fossil impressions too, so he might have had some relevant expertise. But he's, I think, ancient fossil impressions, like trilobite sort of things. I could be wrong about that. I'd have to go into the specifics of his work. But he basically posted on a Bigfoot forum, after he saw like a 2D picture of it, said like, oh, that looks like an elk lay to me. And then that quote got reprinted in other like Bigfoot newsletters and things. And that's blossomed into this, oh, well, experts proved that was an elk lay, right? Like, actually, no, that's not the case. Now, I've never seen the original cast. The story of it there were multiple people involved in collecting it, and they all had different visions about how it should be treated. And so some of the people that collected it thought like, we should take this around to various universities, like bring it to the experts and have them evaluate it, because anything associated with a Sasquatch, like people are not really going to get off their couch for, you know what I mean?
Right.
So if you're like, hey, we think we have Sasquatch evidence, why don't you fly to Seattle and we'll show it to you? Like most anthropologists are going to go, no, thanks.
Right.
And so some people thought like we should be taking it to their doorstep and trying to get, expert opinions. And then other people had thought like, no, because it's this big multi-100-pound cast of plaster. I mean, the thing is huge. It's like a tabletop size, that they thought like if we take it on the road, it might get damaged or broken, and then we've lost this thing. And so one of the early luminaries of Sasquatch research, a journalist named John Green, had a cast made of the cast, which I did see. And I actually found that one easier to sort of interpret than the images I'd seen of the cast, because, you take a cast, it's basically a negative of the impression of the ground. And so you're looking at this thing, but everything that would be impressed is now expressed, you know what I mean? And so you're trying to see like, how does this look like a thing laid here? But then you cast that and it looks like the impression as it was in the ground. So John had this negative of the Skookum cast made, and it was sort of a resin and painted brown. So it looked like the mud, like the earth, and you could just see it very clearly, plain as day. And there's hair flow patterns in it that are not consistent with an elk, that are more consistent with apes. There are really interesting features like where it seemed to have rolled back a few times. There are these impressions of buttocks. The technical term would be the natal cleft. Most people would know it as the butt crack. But in apes, very often the natal cleft is devoid of hair, and the hair flows in a certain way towards the natal cleft. And all that's present within this cast. So there's various things that are more consistent with apes than they would be consistent with something like an elk. And then there's a few other, handprints and a couple of these what are interpreted as like butt prints, where something seems to have sat down for an extended period of time and left an impression. But the most prolific impressions that have been documented are footprints, and then in smaller number handprints, and then there's a handful of these other that body impression or other like partial body impressions.
Sure. That's funny. Little did Sasquatch know he was faxing his butt. It's a very human thing, It's just human thing to do there. He's definitely a cousin, maybe. Also, so has there ever been? Because I know I heard at one point like that they said they recovered some DNA or something, but has there ever been any hair, any DNA, anything like that?
Well, there's been a lot of hair. But DNA has not been extracted from it or fully sequenced from it yet. And that's one of the frustrating things. And, the subject has been so stigmatized for so long and so relegated to the fringe and the taboo. One of the things, because I'd heard all these claims and I'd interfaced with so many, not only researchers, but witnesses, and then other, investigators, let's say, and then even academics who've looked into this. And so I had heard many descriptions of hair analyses, some of which were from the people that conducted the analyses, but most of which came from the people that submitted the analyses. So when I went to write the book, it's like, okay, I've got to collect all this information and present like everything we know about purported or potential or supposed Sasquatch hair. And the frustrating thing is that nothing has ever been published about that in a formal sense, in terms of like an academic paper or a journal paper or something of that nature. Usually what's happened is that a sample submitter has made contact with someone who's in a position of expertise, and the person was willing to do it out of either personal interest, curiosity, or as a favor, and then offered their expert opinion in writing, in a media statement, in an anecdote as part of a different project like a book or something like that. So although I have a tremendous amount, I think what I have in my book is probably the largest compendium of purported hair samples and the analyses by these named experts. But none of those people ever wrote a paper about what they'd done, which is really frustrating. Or it'd be for media productions, like if Animal Planet or National Geographic had a hair sample and they'd line someone up to give it a serious look, and then the only thing that ever happened with it is they said on camera, like, here's my take on it. So we don't have like data that we can look at ourselves other than like claims, let's say. So frustratingly, I think there's a lot of work to be done on these hair samples. A long story short, they share physical characteristics. So like you collect a number of anomalous hair samples or samples that are taken from people that they think are associated with a Sasquatch because either they claim to have had a sighting or an encounter somewhere, or, maybe a witness had an encounter and investigators go there and find hair. And so a lot of people for a lot of years thought they were in possession of like an abundance of Sasquatch hair. And then, there was one particular guy who came along, Dr. Henner Fehrenbach, who was put out the call. It's like, well, send all these to me. He was an expert in microscopy, and he also worked in, there was a primate research center in Beaverton, Oregon. And so he was an expert in various, aspects of primates, but especially like the structure, because hair is anatomy. I mean, it's a physical structure, so it has anatomy and it can be looked at. And so once he was able to eliminate like, oh, this is bear, this is raccoon, this is deer, this is elk, he was left with a number of samples that he couldn't readily attribute to anything else. But interestingly, they all shared characteristics of each other. So they seem to have been shed by the same species, or at least the same genus of animal, that were collected at disparate places all across North America over many decades. And they shared characteristics with primate hair in terms of like the scale pattern of the hair, the way that the keratin structure creates these little scales, almost like the skin of a reptile or something like that. So the scale pattern was the most consistent with primates. So it seemed to be some sort of primate, but not human hair, and not, again, gorilla, orangutan, chimp, etc. So I think that's really fascinating that, whether the Sasquatch exists or not, we should all take notice that, oh, well, there's something that shedding hair that you would think in the 21st century would be able to identify anything. Now, most of those were not subjected to any sort of DNA tests. And a lot of this happened in the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's a bit more primitive in terms of what we could perform with DNA tests.
Sure.
The frustrating thing with all of the genetic tests that have been done on purported Sasquatch samples, it's a similar story to the hair samples in that people did it as a sort of one-off thing, as either a favor or out of personal curiosity or as part of a production. And the story usually goes, I'm making a broad generalization here without going into every single instance, but let's say for hair, for example, you can look at the structure of it under, a microscope and see that like this is non-human, anatomically speaking. But when you're conducting DNA tests, obviously you have to use some sort of primers. And, if we're positing that it's some kind of ape, well, you've got to use ape primers or even human primers. Or even if you're using universal primers, like mostly the apes they would look for something like humans. And so if you only extract a little bit of DNA from this hair, maybe it's old or degraded or weathered, or, the cellular structure inside the medulla, which is usually the biggest repository of DNA in a hair, might be fragmented or, again, old, weathered, degraded. You pull out these little segments, and of course, what's it going to be the most analogous to? Well, it's going to be the most analogous to humans. I mean, we share almost, we share about 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. Almost 99%, we share about like 97, 98% of our DNA with gorillas. We share about, 97 to 96% of our DNA with orangutans. So if you didn't have an orangutan on file, fully sequenced, and you only got, you got an orangutan here and you pulled out a few sequences, well, your primers, human primers, are going to hit as a match. And so you'd go, oh, well, there's no such thing as orangutans. It's got to be just a human. You throw it out,
Right.
Well, that seems to be what happens in many of these cases. And I've seen it play out over and over again where you have the anatomists on the one hand saying like, there is no way this is a human hair. And then the people doing these very cursory, superficial, sort of preliminary DNA tests are like, hey, as far as we can tell, this is human. And so when those people butt heads and the decision is made, well, it's clearly not a hair that was shed by a human, the interpretation is, oh, well, it must have been contaminated by human handling. Someone sneezed on it or they touched it without gloves. And despite our best efforts to clean it, all we're getting is this human sample. And that's happened so very many times that it's like, well, if you could extract enough sequence, if you could fully sequence the DNA of that hair sample, you might find that, again, if they're as closely related to us as orangutans, there'd be a 3% difference. That's a very, very small difference. So you'd have to have all the data to find that. Now, unfortunately, there was a fraudulent DNA study or fraudulent DNA claims. I don't even know if the study actually occurred or not, but very dubious claims, let's say, that came out that people, I think, emotionally were so invested in because they felt like this was the answer they'd been looking for. And it's been fairly thoroughly debunked. Maybe fraudulent would be too harsh a word. Maybe it was just a faux pas and a misinterpretation, but some of the actions lead me and others to think that it was intentionally presented a certain way. So
that might have been the one I heard of. I heard of one at one point where they're like, oh, they sequenced Sasquatch DNA, and I think there was video too. And when I went to look at it, it was like you needed to pay to view the video or something. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. This seems a little. If this was a real scientific discovery, it would be, hey, here it is. You know what I mean? It's on network news and things. So
yeah, that was back in like 2012, 2013, and that to me is one of the more unfortunate things that ever happened to the subject, because it was a major setback for two reasons. Is that these people, I think, did collect a lot of samples that who knows what they were, because they were able to put the word out of like, we're going to take this here, we're going to do what no one else has done. And so they had access to the most dedicated field researchers and the most credible witnesses. And so who knows, some of what they received might have been the real deal, but we'll never know. But essentially what was presented was that their interpretation was that, it was some sort of like novel species that seemed to be the result of hybridization between Homo sapiens females and an unknown male, DNA sort of provider, which people interpreted as like, oh, it's a genetically engineered hybrid created by extraterrestrials, all these wild explanations, but
the
it
Russian
really
government.
So the bit of data that was released and made available to the public, people very quickly, experts who could evaluate the data saw that like, nope, one of those samples is absolutely a Homo sapien. One of them is absolutely a black bear. And the other one is absolutely a domestic dog. And so there are, because we share DNA with so many forms of life, we just share the most of it with other great apes, but we share DNA with dogs and cats and rats and bananas, just in smaller portions. So if you're using human primers on a banana, you'll find some conserved, DNA. And so you could say like, this banana is a human hybrid, something of that nature. So unfortunately, no, but there are efforts underway now that I think hold some promise where people would take it more seriously. And it's the same thing too, these claims. Like I get frustrated because very often the cynical argument or the skeptical side would say something like, well, these are just claims and claims are worthless. It's like, okay, fair enough. Like that can be your take. If I produce, 1,000 witnesses or whatever, you could say, well, a claim is a claim and it's worthless. But then when you look at these, oh, well, there's no such thing as a Sasquatch. They looked at that and said it was human DNA in these samples I was talking about earlier. And it's like, okay, well, where's their data? It's like, oh, well, he said it on, this National Geographic channel. They looked at the hair and he said, oh, this is just human. It's like, okay, that's a claim. Show me the data. So if we're going to dismiss Sasquatch eyewitnesses, I think we could dismiss the people, there's a couple of people in particular that are always like the go-to evidence analysts on a lot of these shows where they'll be presented with some compelling piece of evidence and then run genetic tests, whether it's a hair sample or hairs collected from what seems to be like a bedding site or around tracks. And then they say on camera, like, we did the analysis and seems to us it was just a human, It's like, okay, well, until you publish that data, that's equally just a claim. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on all these samples. And I hope those kind of things happen.
Right. It reminds me of like 10 years ago, if you brought up UFOs, people thought you were a kook and you were crazy. And now since the government's come out with some of the videos from the Navy and some of these things have been made public, and they're now anyone you talk to, like, no, I think UFOs are probably real. And it's like now they're open to the idea, and it's the Sasquatch phenomenon almost needs the same thing. It almost needs that aha moment where the public goes, oh, wait, maybe there's more. And I'm not just going to accept. It seems like sometimes people are just waiting for one person of authority to disagree so they can go there.
That's exactly it. Because there are pieces of multimedia evidence that are much more clear and high resolution and more detailed of Sasquatches than there are of these videos. Now, what's the difference? Like if we take the Patterson film, for example, that's been debated now since 1967, and I don't think anyone's going to resolve it anytime soon. But, it's a longer clip. It's broad daylight. There's a lot of detail. It's a fascinating clip. It's a fascinating story. It's pretty compelling. But you look at the Go Fast or the Gimbal or the Tic Tac videos, and like they don't have anywhere near that amount of information. So why are they so impactful? It's the authority. It's who collected these videos and under what circumstances. Like, they're fighter pilots, our military pilots with this high technology. And so it's funny to me that like you have this really detailed piece of visual evidence that people have been debating since 1967 and people just want to write off. But then you have this, and it's fairly clear, all things considered. I know it was shot on film, and film is grainy and it's at a distance, even though it's set to like a universal focus, but it's not as blurry and grainy as people make it out to be. Versus you look at those thermal videos, because all three of those UFO videos, those are thermal imagers. Nowhere, those really are blurry, and totally ambiguous. But it's solely because of who it's associated with that people go. So we defer a lot of our trust to institutions and institutions that hold certain amounts of authority. So I think you're exactly right on that. If instead of Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, like two cowboys from Yakima, If it had been two people who, worked for, Fish and Game or the Department of Fish and Wildlife or Department of Natural Resources or something of that nature, it might have had a different impact. Or if it had been two top level, biologists from some university, people might take it a little bit differently. So I do think we need that, because we put so much trust in institutions and grant them, rightfully so in some cases, all this authority. So the other funny thing about it is that, dealing with this for 20 years and pursuing it like as much as I have, I've met many people that have mystical or metaphysical or supernatural views of the natural world or of the world as such, or whatever's beyond. And there's all sorts of beliefs associated with that, whether people are exploring the idea of the survival of consciousness or the existence of a soul, or, whether the ether records events and plays them back in the future. But I talk to people that have no qualms whatsoever discussing ghosts or the survival of consciousness or something beyond the physical. And then with the UFOs, like, people have no qualms talking about something out there because the universe is infinite and anything. But when you talk about, like, hey, there might be one extra mammal in North America, it's like the most stigmatized thing. Like, oh, you can't possibly believe that hogwash, which I think of those three propositions. I mean, it's clear people do have experiences of high strangeness. People see or experience apparitions. People see lights in the sky. People claim to see, unrecognized apes in North America. To me, of those three, the Sasquatch is the least extraordinary, and people criticize me for this, but I'm like, look, we know apes exist. And so I don't have to create a new sort of animal to answer this question. We know that apes, almost identical to the Sasquatch, lived in Asia for a very long time, from 8.6 million years ago to about 80,000 years ago. They lived alongside our ancestors and early Homo sapiens. So we did already sort of share the planet with something like the Sasquatch. So in a way, it's like the Sasquatch phenomenon has already happened before. I think it's the most ordinary of all the supposedly extraordinary phenomena or claims, but yet it's easier for someone in the modern world to say they encountered an extraterrestrial technology, or that they encountered, the surviving consciousness of a long deceased person, than it is for them to say, I saw an ape that has not yet been recognized to exist in North America. It's crazy to me,
yeah, amen. Awesome. So then maybe we can switch over, because you mentioned the Patterson film. And that's one where, and I've watched different things, like Monster Quest, I think, was one that did some analysis of it and things. Maybe then maybe you could set it up a little, just for anyone that maybe hasn't seen it. It's probably the most widely seen one, but maybe you could set it up a little, and then we can talk through that.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean, it has been the most debated. It might be the most scrutinized, debated piece of film ever, next to like the Zapruder film. I've heard multiple people make that comparison.
That's what I was just thinking of too.
I almost thought, like, man, if I could write the book without even mentioning this, I would. Obviously I can't. Like, it's a crucial part of the history of like modern Sasquatchery, but it's just been beaten so hard to death, but there's still no resolution. It's like, so, there was a guy that was from Yakima, Washington, who was pursuing the Sasquatch phenomenon, named Roger Patterson. And he's an interesting character. Some people see him as like a sort of chronically failing entrepreneur, and other people see them as like a con man, because he tried to get these numerous things off the ground. And he was very talented, it seems, and had a sort of artistic eye, and, claimed to have like come up with these inventions. Somewhere in the back of my memory, there's some claim that, like, he claimed he invented the little square that goes on the bread bag that holds, you spin the bread bag. And you go, I think he had some claim to inventing or improving on some technology like that. I don't remember, but just a weird reputation, you know what I mean? Sure. But was a cowboy, basically, like this rodeo guy. And he wrote a book called Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist? And he had the intention of filming a documentary. And he did film quite a bit of stuff, actually. He would do a lot of these interviews with claimants and witnesses, and he would go to some of these places where these things supposedly occurred. And at the time, there were a lot of tracks and sighting reports coming out of Bluff Creek, California. So So where the original tracks that coined the word Bigfoot was coined based on these tracks came in 1958. There was a road building crew that was cutting the first roads into these drainages, and these massive tracks walked across the areas they clear cut. And so they called that individual Bigfoot. It wasn't supposed to be. Even John Green made a joke like, hey, I think if they knew they were about to give a name to an entire species, they probably would have thought a little bit harder than just, Bigfoot.
Bigfoot, right?
So that was in 58. And so throughout the 60s, more tracks were found and more encounters were reported. And so Roger went down there with his friend Bob Gimlin, who was another rodeo rider, horseman. And they were down there hoping to find tracks. According to their testimony, they were down there to film the environment, to film themselves in the pursuit, and hoping to find more tracks that they could document. And, according to their testimony, they're riding upstream up Bluff Creek, and they round a bend and they see this Sasquatch, squatted down, or, squatted would probably be the best description, down near the creek. So we might presume, if it was a living animal, if the story that they're telling is true, that it was drinking water. And at which point, they were each on horseback, their horses reared, and it stood up and saw them. And Roger, having, according to his testimony, prepared for this and trained many times, he was able to, while wrestling with this horse, he even claimed, I think it reared and fell, but he was able to get his camera out of his saddlebag and start chasing it. And so he ran up to cross the creek. And so the first few seconds of the footage are blurry as he's running, holding this handheld camera. And then he steadies himself and it's walking away, sort of at first looks kind of like perpendicular, and then starts to go at an angle, or parallel to the lens, and then starts to go perpendicular at an angle away from it. And so the whole clip's about a minute long. He and Gimlin stayed and cast, there was this line of tracks on the sandbar. So they cast what looked to their eyes like the cleanest left foot and right foot. Because, as an animal's moving along, interacting with the ground, most tracks are pretty messy, especially if there's any kind of speed involved. And so some of the other casts, the criticism was like, well, we can't tell what the shape of the foot is because it's just a big smeared, blurred impression as the thing moved through. And so they tried to get the cleanest ones they could find that were most like the shape of the foot. And later they got criticized. Oh, these are too crisp and clean. But luckily that's not where the story ends. But so then they come out of Bluff Creek, they make some phone calls. He called the Eureka Time Standard to tell them what had occurred, and some other contacts there. A guy named Al Hodgson, I believe he called Sil McCoy, who worked for the Forest Service there. They mail the film back to Roger's brother-in-law, Al Diatley, to have it developed, and essentially that's the story. Now, interestingly, just a couple of days later, there was a timber cruiser who worked for the Forest Service, a guy named Lyle Laverty. I think the film, if I'm not mistaken, was filmed on a Friday, and Lyle was there either Sunday or Monday. I think they had heard, this thing supposedly happened, because the Eureka Time Standard ran the story the next day. Like, we just talked to Roger Patterson. He claims he saw one of these things, and he thinks he might have even filmed it. Because back in the film days, you couldn't it wasn't like an iPhone where you can play back the video. So he had to ship it off and was like, I hope I got it.
Right.
They hadn't watched it yet. So Laverty went out there with his crew, and they photographed a number of the tracks in this line of tracks, including a lot of the messy ones. And then another Sasquatch researcher, a guy that was a taxidermist named Bob Titmus, went out there and he cast 10 tracks consecutively. He had enough plaster to do so, and he just cast them as they laid, regardless of how clean or dirty or messy they were. So we have a pretty good record of the site from the footage, and then this subject, from the two casts that Roger and Bob brought out of there, from the photographs of the trackway that Laverty took, and from the 10 casts that Bob Titmus obtained. Now, it's been such a controversial thing, and I think a lot of that has to do with, well, there are implications. If you could prove somehow, which obviously can't be done from film, but if you could prove that that is a living animal and not a person in a suit, because those are the only two options. It's not a bear, it's not a possum, you know what I mean? So, well, if you could prove these, which is what most people have tried to do, is prove that it can't be a human. And I just don't think that's possible. They try to say these proportions, this, that, or the other, absolutely rule out humans. Well, I don't know if that's doable. I mean, there's a lot to suggest that it's non-human, which makes it so compelling in terms of these these limb proportions in terms of the way it moves. The gait is markedly non-human. It's very different than the average human bipedal walk. The width of the thing is pretty impressive in terms of the width at the shoulders, the width at the hips. A lot of the proportions seem to be non-human.
Did the gait, the tracks, as you were talking about, the mid part tarsal, what is it? The break in the middle of the foot?
The mid-tarsal break?
Tarsal break, yeah. Did the cast show that on there?
What's really interesting, oh man, I could probably email this to you if you wanted to pipe it in. I could ask for Dr. Meldrum's permission, because I think it's his. I'm sure he wouldn't mind though. So, but just for the sake of our conversation, I'll still email this to you so that your viewers can see a high resolution version. Great. So like, I don't know if you can see that. So those are 3D scans of the tracks. And so you really see the mid-tarsal break clearly in this track.
Oh, wow.
You see that there?
Yeah, I see what you're talking about completely.
You see indications of it in these other ones. Now, if you take that same track line and you turn it on its side, you see...
Oh, wow.
I know you're probably seeing the reflection on the screen.
Oh, no, I can see it okay. Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I'll email you. You can see the lines there. Absolutely. And so the impression of that midfoot flexibility is expressed in varying degrees. Now, again, some of them are more dramatic than others, and some of them are flatter and a bit more subtle, but it is present there in these varying degrees of expression, which is like, those don't seem to be stompers. And again, that's 1967. So that well predates a lot of our understanding of that bit of how crucial that morphology is to the history of, or the evolution of bipedal locomotion.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing, but obviously what most people attack is the absence of Sasquatch evidence elsewhere, which is always kind of funny to me. And I lay that sort of thing out in the book too, is that sometimes you can show people like, here's some things we need to talk about. We need to talk about A, B, and C. And they'll go, yeah, but where's D? It's like, no. Can we talk about these first? Yeah. Well, you got to show me D first, and it's like, I think that's part of the visceral rejection of the Patterson film is people go, why hasn't anyone shot and killed one? Where's the body? It's like, well, let's talk about what's on the footage here and not what's not here yet, because there is an implication. Like if that's a living thing, well, it's not just some genetic freak one-off that was dropped off by a stork. Like it would be a member of a population.
Right.
And I pulled a bunch of quotes in the book to show that like a lot of the experts who looked at it in the time said things like, this looks really compelling to me, but it's mind-boggling to even consider that there could be a population of these things out there. And so I can't go there. It's like, well, which is it? Either it looks legitimate or it doesn't, but it's always that implication that seems to be the most shocking. And then of course there have been multiple people that have come forward over the years that try to take some sort of ownership, like, oh, I'm the guy that faked that. I'm the guy that wore the suit. There's been multiple people that claim they were in the suit, one of whom was an associate of Patterson-Gimlin's. And so people have taken his claims a little more seriously. There's been multiple people that claim to have made the costume, and it ranges from, costume makers with like an off-the-shelf gorilla suit to claims that Patterson worked with other people to make it out of dead horsehide, and just all these wild claims. And so it's a fascinating case. And I will say, I've seen so many, I've read everything that's ever been published on this subject for the most part. And I've watched all the documentaries and listened to podcasts, and people get so much of it wrong just because there is so much out there. So there's a podcast called Astonishing Legends, and they usually cover a number of like paranormal or esoteric topics. And they did a 6-part series on the Patterson film a few years ago. And I was really reticent to listen to it because so many people get it wrong. And also like it's a podcast about a piece of visual evidence. So it's like, you're going to listen to something you have to look at, it's difficult. And they knocked it out of the park. It is so accurate and detailed. And they interviewed a lot of the people that were involved, the principals that are still alive. And so if anyone wants to do a deep dive on that without buying a book, go listen to the Astonishing Legends 6-part Patterson-Gimlin film series. It's very, very good.
Right. Awesome. I'll link it up here. I'll find it online and throw the link. Anyone that wants to catch it. What do you say then? Because then people, will say like, oh, so why isn't there more footage? And I know there is more footage in general, but why haven't we found any other, I guess, just as good footage? Is there other good footage, or what would your comment be to anyone that suggests that?
Well, what makes the Patterson footage so unique, because there are lots of clips of video and footage that are purportedly of a Sasquatch, and some of them are so ambiguous that it's like, we'll never know. You could scrutinize that until, the cows come home, and you'll never come to a solution. Like, again, the Patterson film has been beaten to death, right, and it still holds up pretty well. I mean, a lot of people every year reemerge with some new analysis and like a newer, cleaner version, and seeing things that people hadn't quite picked up on before. And so that's an interesting, I've heard people say, like, how could these two cowboys from Yakima have created something that they couldn't have known where technology was going to go in 5 years, let alone 50 years, to make something that would hold up under so many different iterations and different types of scrutiny. But what makes it the most compelling is it is daylight, and it's unobstructed for the most part, and it's extended. So it's not like in a dense forest where there's, brush and trees and other obstructions, where the thing just bolts and it's gone. And so you only see it for a second and a half or 2 seconds. Now, the case that I tried to make that occurred to me when I went down there, because I went there in 2010, and it looks wildly different. It's jungle thick there again, as is like the natural state of that place. But what had occurred is that in 1964, there was a massive flood that flooded all the tributaries of the Klamath and then the Klamath itself. And when I drove out there, like, you're on this mountain road looking way down at the Klamath, and then there are markers way up above you on the road of here's the flood line of 1964. Like, it's unfathomable to think of how high the water got. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that there had been like a freak snowstorm that dumped a ton of snow in the region, and then the temperature spiked and melted all that off and created this big flood. So what you're seeing in Bluff Creek there, if anyone wants to look up that video on YouTube, Patterson 1967, you're seeing like a big exposed sandbar and a whole lot of debris. And what had occurred is, in that 1964 flood, there was so much water rushing through. It's a really steep, tight, narrow drainage. It's almost like a little canyon, and it denuded all the vegetation along the waterway, just wiping everything out. So there's deadfall stuff everywhere. And so every animal that lives in that drainage, if it wants to drink water, it has to emerge from the tree line and walk across an open sandbar to access Bluff Creek, the waterway. Right. And I think that's a very special situation, in that in most places that's just not occurring. Like, the forest comes, the creeks meander through the forest. And I think if that footage is really of a living Sasquatch, which again would require, if Sasquatches exist as an extant species of ape, that I think that's what explains that. It's like, here's a thing that had to leave the security of the tree line in order to drink, and probably didn't anticipate, because a lot of people would say, like, oh, well, Patterson got close because he was on horseback. The Sasquatch heard the horse hooves and wasn't scared. It's like, it's not like they share the planet, or they share North America with horses. It's not like there's horses all over, wild horses everywhere.
Right.
But again, they claim that when they saw it, it was squatting with its head by the water. So it's down drinking, maybe. And so maybe the ambient sound of the rushing creek was loud enough that it didn't hear these things approach. But also, like, when it got caught flat-footed, no pun intended, with these cowboys there, it has to walk quite a distance to get back into the security of the trees there. Right. So that's a pretty special environmental context that is pretty rare. Whereas a lot of the other clips of footage that I think are really compelling are in dense forests, and you're catching glimpses of it as it moves behind obstructions and things of that nature. So it's a lot harder to analyze. There's a forest canopy, and so it's dark and shaded, so you're not seeing it bathed in sunlight. There's a really interesting clip of thermal video that was obtained in central North Carolina in 2009 by a guy named Mike Green, and I described that in the book. And then that's available on YouTube too, that you could look that up, where he had a thermal imager on a tripod, essentially watching an area. And that clip's like 2 or 3 minutes long, and it gets unobstructed. Now you're just seeing a heat signature, so it's about the quality and clarity of those military UFO videos that we were just describing, but it's still really fascinating. And then there's a couple of other clips, but it's difficult because I try to practice all the time, whether I'm with my iPhone or, I do carry like a Canon point and shoot for images. And I only started carrying the Canon like a couple of years ago, but I've had multiple black bear encounters where by the time like I get everything together, because their normative response is to run, So if they get spooked in any way, they'll just bolt. So as I'm creeping along, I might not even know it's there, and then I step on something and it cracks, and then I hear something tearing off, and I look and it's a bear, and so I'll have these images of like the forest and a black blob in the distance, and I know it was a bear because I saw it with my own eyes. But then it's like, if I showed it to you, you'd go, "Hey, man, I don't see anything that looks like a bear to me in that picture." Right. And so I try to have some sympathy for, because I've seen a lot of images like that people swear to me that, they had a Sasquatch encounter and they tried to document it, in their fright or that, their confusion or shock. And here's all they got was this blurry thing. And it's like, well, maybe you did. I mean, but again, there's nothing to me that looks like a Sasquatch in that picture. Right. So
you need like we were just in an Uber the other week, and the guy had the camera that's just mounted up there, the dashboard cams. You need like just a hat cam that's just, comes on immediately for you. So it just stares at what you're looking at.
Yeah, they make those and people wear them. And if you look at the category of witnesses or claimants, let's say, the majority, a large proportion most of them are motorists. They're people that see them cross through when they're driving through viable habitat. So probably statistically speaking, the best thing you could do is drive through viable habitat, especially at night, because a lot of this happens at night, and have a good dash cam,
Right. Yeah, sure. That's actually a good, when I start researching, that's what I'll do. I wanted to ask about that though, because then that film is during the day, so you do get, and it's out in the open, so you get a great view of it. But when you watch shows like Finding Bigfoot and different shows like that, it's almost always at night. And I don't know if that's just like it's a TV thing or if most of the research is done at night. I wonder, why is it done at night, or maybe I'm just wrong.
Well, interestingly enough, like when you look at reports from a statistical perspective, the first person that really did this well was the Canadian journalist John Green that I brought up earlier. He collected basically by the early to mid 70s, let's say, something like 15 or 1600 reports, people that he had interviewed and networked with and to find other witnesses. And so he started doing these, he had a questionnaire from which he could derive like these statistical analyses. So one of the interesting things is that when you looked at the time of day, about half of the sightings were during the day and about half at night, which is really suggestive because, first of all, you can see much further during the day, and there's many, many, many more people out during the day.
Sure.
So, better visual conditions and more observers, more eyes to see. So if you're producing as many sightings at night, when you have much more compromised visibility and fewer people in the environment, fewer observers, then that would suggest that they're very active at night, to produce that same number. Sure. And, there are many animals that live this lifestyle that they call it's a cathemeral lifestyle or cathemerality versus just strictly nocturnal or strictly diurnal or strictly crepuscular, dawn and dusk. And we're learning that so much more about other animals now because we're mostly daytime creatures. So most wildlife research happened during the day. And so there's plenty of animals that in times past we assumed were diurnal. And then once people invented game cameras, and especially ones with like infrared flash, so it's not as visible, realizing oh, these animals are active at periods all day long and all night long. Sure. And that's what they call a cathemeral lifestyle. So it's like activity, rest, regardless of whether the sun's out or not. Right. And these things seem to fit that lifestyle.
Sure. Well, it makes sense too. I think it was humans, right? I think it was the sleeping 8 hours a night is more of a modern thing, as people used to sleep for a bit and then wake up and be up for a couple hours in the middle of the night and then go back to sleep and go to
probably
work from there.
So. And we're such social creatures that live in social units. I've heard us described as like, chimpanzees with like a beehive sort of lifestyle. You know what I mean? And I've heard some really interesting hypotheses that the reason our sleep cycles are so different is that that's like a naturally selected thing, that like if you had a group of people at a camp, someone's always on the verge of being awake. So that if a predator came near, or a rival social unit or something like that, there's always someone who could wake up the other ones. Whereas if we all went into the deepest, REM together at the same time, we'd be easy pickings. Nobody would wake up when the predatory cat comes and drags somebody off,
Right, sure.
But a lot of the more bold, intimidating, I don't want to call it aggressive because that might imbue too much meaning, but confrontational behaviors that people describe, a lot of that happens at night, as if the Sasquatches are somehow bolder at night or willing to approach closer at night. Because, most reports are pretty mundane. And in most of the ones that happen on foot, for example, it's like the person sees the Sasquatch sees the person, and they both run in opposite directions as fast as they can. That's most reports. Or, they're driving by and it's just standing there. That's why I also think like these are not very good mythological creatures, because they're not like ripping people's arms off and beating them to death. They're just kind of standing there or running away.
Right.
It's pretty boring animal behavior. But in a subset of reports, they are confrontational. They'll thrash vegetation and make loud sounds, and make these percussive sounds and growl and huff and scream. And a lot of that happens at night, as if, they're, like I said, bolder or more prone to confrontation. And so if you're a researcher and you're trying to document something, well, you kind of want that to happen. You want that approach, that confrontation, that interaction. So that's a big part of why so many people pursue it at night. And then obviously when it comes to the television thing, like they love that, they they want everyone bathed in that infrared light where their eye. I think it probably started with things like all those ghost shows, because they shoot them in those haunted locations in the dark, and so everyone's in that green night vision with the reflective eyes. And then the Sasquatch shows came along, and that's almost like a similar sort of scenario, except you're just in the woods instead of like a abandoned prison or whatever the case may be, an abandoned mansion. And so, I wish more of them were daytime oriented. I know Cliff and Bobo talk about that all the time, because, they did 100 episodes of Finding Bigfoot. It ran a long time.
Sure.
And a lot of times people will write into the podcast to ask, like, why did you only go out at night? And they're like, that's just the way. They'd go with the witness very often to the location during the day to get the lay of the land, and then come back at night and try to elicit an encounter or approach or something like that.
Right. It's funny. My daughter, I have we have 4 kids. The 2 oldest daughters, we're a blended family. Their mom lives in Martinsville, Indiana. And at one point, my oldest daughter, when she was graduating high school, had wanted to go out and live with her mom for a while. So she flew out and was living with her. And we get there and they knew I was into it. And like, there's a Bigfoot, statue is too strong of a word, like outline, like sit out by the city. And they're like, oh yeah, they did an episode of Finding Bigfoot right here. You gotta
that's
watch
cool.
it. Yeah.
I know they did 2. I think they did 2 Indiana episodes. I was with them for a couple of days for one of those. And that was the one that was right up on the lake. We were near a town called Chesterton. Is that near?
I don't know. Martinsville's tiny, so it might have been. It might be the bigger city by there. I'm not sure. There is a lake there. So her mom lives by a lake in a little community called Painted Hills. But I just know we would get off in Indianapolis and then drive the 45 minutes or so. So Chesterton's 45 minutes or so from Indianapolis. It might be the same one.
Gotcha. Yeah, it was a cool area. It was fun being out there, but. And, the nighttime thing, I think the flip side of that is for a lot of the newer sort of researchers, because, a lot of people just want to have an experience. And hey, I'm in that boat too. Like, I would love to see one. I like to have, experience things. It sort of renews the fire, lets you know there's something out there. But it's a lot easier for so many of the people that get into this subject have very little points of contact with the natural world. Maybe they're urbanites or suburbanites or whatever. And so they go out in the forest and like, you want to talk about novelty. I mean, like every sound is novel to them. They've never heard barred owls. They've never heard barred owls have a territorial dispute. They've never heard packs of coyotes, And so everything that they can't readily identify, which is most things, At night, they'll go,
Sure.
"Oh my God, there's a Sasquatch!" We're surrounded
Yeah.
by them. Versus like, well, if you go out during the day and you hear weird sounds, you can just go look and go, "Oh, that's a," whatever the case, that's a pheasant, that's this, that's that, it's a turkey.
Right.
So I do think that sort of adds to the lore of them being more active at night. And even in the first, probably the first 10 years of me doing field research, most of what I did was at night, with night vision and thermal imagers and things like that. But now I'm a lot more oriented, like, I want to answer the question for myself, like, does the Sasquatch exist? Are these real animals? And, if so, I'd like to document that if I did have an encounter, some kind of visual thing. And so most of the time I'm focused on the daytime now.
Sure.
So you see a lot more in nature that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if we could talk the vocalizations, because you had mentioned, like, there's the misidentification, but then I know there's also like the howls and whatever else that people have described. Is there so I guess maybe kind of a two-parter. It was one is maybe you can tell the audience, like, what are the vocalizations that people have heard that aren't the obvious misidentifications, and then two, what's been done to kind of analyze those.
Certainly. Well, people have attributed all sorts of sounds to the Sasquatch. The most commonly reported and recorded ones, like, first of all, the loudest sounds an animal makes are the ones you're going to be the most likely to hear, because it's not as reliant or dependent on proximity. If an animal makes really quiet sounds, like, you've got to be pretty close to it to hear that. And most of the time you're just not close to them. So the thing that people report the most, and it's also been documented the most, are these big bellowing moaning howls. And the best way to describe it, it's like it starts at a certain pitch and then ascends to a higher pitch and sustains and then descends back. And it's in a lower register, almost like a, big booming thing. Sure. So some canids do something similar, but it's much, much higher pitched, like coyote howls, for example, and things of that nature. And so that's what people hear the most often, because it just carries for long distances and they're able to record the most often. And there have been a number of people who have analyzed recordings, because I've heard that sound in the field 11 times. I had to go back through all my field notes when I was writing the book to kind of lay that out. And I've heard it in Southern Appalachia. I've heard it in the Ouachitas of Arkansas and Oklahoma. I've heard it in the Pacific Northwest. So I know for certain that there is some animal out there, some species of animal that makes that sound. And the typical analysis is that, it is mammalian in nature. Bioacoustics experts are the ones who look into this, biologists that specialize in sound, and said that, they cannot attribute it to any known mammal anywhere in the world, let alone not just North America, but anywhere, that what's in these recordings doesn't seem to be synthesized, so it's not mechanical. It's not a created, fabricated sound, and it does not seem to be generated by a human. So I think, once again, so if we talk about the ridge patterns, the hair, these features of tracks, like, you have experts in these fields that are supportive of, like, well, hey, I think there is something going on here. And to me, they're all kind of connected to this Sasquatch phenomenon. But then you add it all up and people still don't want to look at this. They go, yeah, well, where's the body? But anyway, that's the most commonly recorded and analyzed and studied vocalization. You can find many examples of that people have put online. The other sounds that's probably the most common are these sort of very brief ascending in pitch sounds that people call whoops, because that's almost like the automatopoeia of, like, it does this kind of like whoop, almost like a gibbon. It sounds very similar to the whoops that gibbons make. And then people attribute these whistling sort of sounds to them. And then there's these other speech-like sounds that, I've heard that myself. And so it's pretty unnerving to hear, but people have recorded examples of it. But I've met many people that heard it, that are these vocal, I guess you call them like utterances, but I don't think it represents a language or something even protolingual, but they have the characteristics of it. It's like that kind of a sound, Sure. So when you hear that in the field, it's pretty unnerving, because it's so human-like. And then we do everything we can to say, like, is there a person here? How did that person get in? Like, can we find this person? And it's pretty bizarre. So those are the main categories. But then again, because so many people go out into the forest without any familiarity of mundane sounds, that they start to attribute every sound. I don't know if you've ever heard the barred owl typical call is the who cooks for you. Who cooks for you?
Mm-hmm.
When two of them get together and they start to dispute about, like, this is my place, no, this is my place, they call that their territorial dispute calls, and they sound like primates. They do this thing where they go, oh, 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 oh. And so you get two or three of them making that, and it sounds like a cluster of monkeys or primates or something, like apes,
Right.
And so it's hard with witnesses if they don't record the sound when they're like, I know I heard a Sasquatch, and I'm like, tell me what you heard. And it's so subjective to talk about sound. But then you have to parse out, like, oh, okay, it sounds like you probably heard a barred owl because they're abundant all over the continent. Or it sounds like you probably heard coyotes. So for me, like, the only things I really take to the bank are those big bellowing, moaning howls, just because there's nothing else in North America that makes that sound or anything close to that sound. I mean, it's more like, again, it sounds very much like an air raid siren, or the register is like something a cow would produce, that,
Sure.
So when you're in the middle of a wilderness area in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, off trail or anywhere in the country, it's like, there ain't no cows out here, man. Like, what's making that sound? It's pretty,
right.
It's unnerving,
Yeah. I believe it. That's funny. It just made me think of I'm trying to remember where I heard it. There was something like the Sierra sounds or something. It was like an old footage. I think, I forget how old it's kind of back there, where they were really chattering and things. I think I watched it. I think it was like one of the old Leonard Nimoy shows where they had it on there. But has that ever been? Is that anything else ever come of that? Or
those are always interesting to me. One of the gentlemen that recorded some of those, I've spent a little bit of time with him and spoken at events with him. To me, because there's multiple recordings that were made over a few years, and some of them sound quite different than some others. So some of them seem to me to be more likely to be legitimate, in that they sound like things I've heard, and they sound more like the things that many of the witnesses I've spoken to claim to have heard, or a lot of the other researchers I know who've heard it themselves. Versus some of the recordings literally sound like they're right up on a microphone, but they're loud. Sure. But working with, they played music for a living, did a lot of recording and produced podcasts. Like, you live in a world of sound, and so it's like, okay, well, this sounds to me like this mic out in this wilderness area, the thing surely walked up pretty close to it. Whereas the other ones, you can
boom over it.
Yeah, the other ones you can tell it's at a distance. So it's like, I don't know how to interpret that. I don't know if some of those are legitimate and then some of them were fabric. I just don't know. But there were people that studied those in the 1970s. A guy named Lynn Curlin. And he published a paper that was in a collection of books presented or a collection of papers that were put together in book format by the University of British Columbia. And that book is called Man-Like Monsters on Trial. And he sort of made the claim that you could look at the formant structure of these sounds, and from that you could derive the size and length of the vocal apparatus, like the esophagus or the throat or whatever the case may be. And that he could definitively rule out a person. And then other people, to my understanding, said, well, like, couldn't you just do that with a funnel? Would it be different? And it's like, no, it would produce exactly. So you could go like this, and it would produce a different format. So you're creating an elongated vocal apparatus. And so I don't think there's been anything definitive on that. There have been other people in the last decade or so, because a lot of the proximal, like the distant sounds that are associated with, there are whoops that are recorded and some of these percussive sounds. Those distant sounds are more like what I've heard and other people have heard. Brief, like, these brief utterances that are these short bursts. The proximal sounds just go on and on and on. And they're like, it sounds like the Tasmanian devil. It sounds kind of like
so I just thought of just now when you did that. Yeah.
And so there are people who have claimed that they have deciphered a language out of those chaotic chatterings,
Uh-huh.
I've never seen anyone corroborate these claims. Like there's one person in particular who says like he's, in his mind can prove that it's lingual and that there are phonemes and there's syntax and all this. And then one of my very best friends who was also a linguist and held basically the same profession that this individual did is like, no, man, that's not going on there. So
Right.
again, there's so much mythology, even though you have this piece of multimedia evidence that it should be amenable to all sorts of testing and at least interpretations. Like there's still
Right.
wild interpretations that grow around all these that are then reiterated in their myths as fact. I've encountered so many people that, they proved that was a language. I'm like, no, they did not prove anything. Like we don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but
Right.
those
Absolutely.
I'm much more compelled, like I said, about the big bellowing, moaning howls than a lot of the other sound recordings, and especially the ones that get, I don't want to say questionable as a matter. I mean, everything should be questionable because
Sure.
no one's answered this. Do they exist or not? I mean,
Mhm.
so we should question everything to death, so to speak, to take the strongest hammer to it and see if we can make it fall apart. And so I don't know what the source of those recordings are, but I do know most of the analyses, I think you can take a hammer to and they break pretty quickly.
Right. Is there any, before we move on from the evidence, is there any other evidence that you want to bring up or anything else we should consider?
There's nothing in the physical. I think we covered physical evidence pretty well, like trace evidence, impressions, and then multimedia evidence, like photos, videos, vocalizations, and then hair samples. So that's a pretty broad overview. There's a lot of deep dive into all that in the book. So I think if people were intrigued enough, they would learn a lot more there. But I think we pretty much touched on all that stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. And we talked Patterson. So I did want to, because you mentioned the for lack of a better term, because I'm a writer, so I don't speak, so I don't know how to say terms when I'm talking. Kooky kind of ideas out there, right? The interdimensional, or just the more far out ones, right? They're aliens, right? So for anyone that kind of believes in those, right? Is there any of those you've ever looked into? Is there anything to those that, when you're researching it, that you opened your mind and said, okay, well, they're associated with UFO reports or orbs or whatever wild thing might be going on?
Well, there's very little of that association that you could draw other than that some of them occur in the same places.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I would say would be like, okay, well, again, the Sasquatch is not a worldwide phenomenon, and UFOs definitely are. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Sure.
Whatever UFOs are, ultimately, whatever the cause of that is, like people claim to have encountered these lights in the sky or observed craft or whatever the case may be all over the planet. And so, yes, there are UFO sightings in the same regions as Sasquatch sightings, like the Pacific Northwest, let's say. And so people want to say, oh, there's a connection.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Sasquatches are being dropped off by these things. It's like, well, then why don't they drop them off in Hawaii, or why don't they drop them off in, like Iceland or Fiji or these other places around the world where there's UFO sightings, but no Sasquatch reports.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if just because they both occur in the same area, I mean, the orb phenomenon I find really interesting. I've never seen it, but I've talked to so many people that have, and it's got a long representation in history too, will-o-wisps or will-o'-the-wisps or spook lights or ghost lights, or there's a gazillion different names for these things, but they seem to be describing the same, like seemingly autonomous, like balls of light that move around through natural areas. And the most parsimonious explanation I've heard is referred to as like earthquake lights. It has something to do with like tectonic activity or geologic activity. And the fact that it's so geo-restricted. I mean, there's places I've been where everyone has seen the lights there. I still haven't seen them in certain places, but there was a place near Mount Rainier, for example, when I lived in Washington and did a lot of research there. And whenever I'd meet anyone in or around there, I was always trying to get Sasquatch stories. And so it was like a hunter, a fisherman, a hiker, someone on a mountain bike. I'd strike up a conversation, and I cannot tell you how many times I'd be like, hey, you ever see anything unusual out here? And people would be like, there's these lights out here, man. And it was just over and over again. And then I worked retail in Seattle, and people would come in and we'd get small talk. And oh yeah, you ever go out to so and so? And they'd be like, oh yeah, I go there all the time. Oh, you see anything strange? They're like, dude, there's these lights out there, you know. And so I understand why people would say, like, well, these phenomena occur, Sasquatch reports occur, maybe they're connected. It's like, yeah, but you know, there are raccoons out there too. Like, why don't you think the raccoons are associated with the orbs or the UFOs or the deer or, you know, bees or what do you, there's, if you look at it on a population level, like there's more rats and possums and raccoons and all these things than there would be really rare animals like a Sasquatch or even something like a cougar or wolverines, you know. But so no one's willing to say like, oh, you know, the wolverines are shape-shifting into orbs or the deer or the elk are shape-shifting into orbs. But so many people go, well, there's Sasquatches and there's orbs. They must be one and the same. And the Sasquatches can transform into. So I understand why when something poses a great mystery that you might see that like another thing that poses a great mystery, they might just be one and the same mystery. I don't think that's the best way to look at some of these things. I think they should be sort of differentiated or delineated. And then there's also, you know, that old saying of like, you can't solve a mystery with another mystery, or you can't, you know, address the unknown by invoking the unknown. And so what I'm trying to do is to say, okay, well, I have all the facts. Again, like we established, like people have claimed to see these things. There are physical objects touted as evidence associated with the claims, yada, yada. Like, what's the simplest, most parsimonious hypothesis that does not involve in any way the unknown, the unusual, the extraordinary, etc.? Can you because a hypothesis is a story, basically. You know, it's a narrative structure that provides an explanation for an observed phenomena, essentially. So it's like, can I tell a story in the narrowest, tightest set of constraints that makes sense of all this? And to me, that biological hypothesis that these are if they exist, that they're very rare apes that live long lives, that live in large home ranges and are highly mobile. So there's very few of them. They tend to move around a lot. That's why sightings are so rare. They're very unpredictable and difficult to pursue for those reasons. All of that, as I lay on the book, to me serves as a sufficient story for, if they exist, here's the most likely explanation. Like, now again, we first have to establish whether they do or don't exist as living things, but I haven't seen anything that would force me to say, okay, well, I need to widen the aperture to include the unknown. You know, because to me, I don't need the extraterrestrial or the interdimensional in order to explain certain things yet, you know. But a lot of people, that's convenient. Why don't we have a body? Oh, it's because the UFOs pick them up before they die, or whatever the case may be. They
shape shift into whatever it might be. So awesome. So I then think, let me see. Oh, nope. I had one other question before I wanted to transition over. So I think it's kind of the big question. And, you know, in my mind, and I've heard other, like, you know, when I've listened to different things on it, is the notion of, if you see one out in the woods and you've got your, you know, very powerful rifle, do you shoot it? Like, do you want one killed, you know, to get a type specimen, whatever we call them? Where do you stand on that?
Well, it is a necessary part of discovery that, you know, either an entire specimen or some diagnostic portion of a specimen needs to be utilized to establish the existence of this animal, this species, whatever the case may be. That's always been the norm, like the sort of rules of the institutions. And that could be a tooth. I mean, that could be part of a jaw that, you know, of an animal that died of natural causes. It could be any number of things. The difficulty is that, like, for people who are actively trying to establish the existence, you know, there's always been this debate about whether or not someone should intentionally try to dispatch one by lethal means in some manner that's as ethical or as safe as possible. Now, all things considered, I mean, I think there are valid takes on each side of that argument. I've tried to articulate that for years, that, like, some people say that's sad and it's ugly. and a horrible reality. And then other people say it's absolutely necessary because if they do exist, it must be demonstrated. And who knows what threats or pressures they might be under. And so by recognizing them and understanding their habitat, maybe we could protect their habitat. And the reality is, like, both those things are true. They're not at opposition. Like, it is sad, it is ugly, it is necessary. And so I think it is possible to recognize all of that at once, but the community of Sasquatch proponents or believers or enthusiasts is very divided over that question. But, when people posit alternatives like, oh, couldn't you just capture one? It's like, well, is that more ethical to, injure an animal or injure people in the process, or injure both, and then to take it out of its environment alive and have it, like, all you would, my friend Bobo always jokes, like, dude, all you'd learn about is like what they look like when they're really bummed out. I'm like, that's probably true. Where people talk about tranquilization and, as I understand it, like most animals that get tranquilized need to be intubated, which that's no easy task. And then, of those that are intubated, sometimes they can have repercussions and respiratory issues. And so you might have tranquilized them and taken some samples and turn them loose, like, live free, buddy. But you've just prolonged them you've just basically relegated them to a prolonged death. A lot of suffering as these respiratory infections and things happen. And so if they exist and you wanted to get the greatest repository of genetic material, like, if you could take one by lethal means in a way that ensured zero suffering, that might be more ethical than trying to capture one or tranquilize one, or et cetera. I mean, the perfect scenario would be that one that's died of natural causes, deceased naturally, is recovered in some way. I think that the likelihood of that is very low. And I lay that out pretty in thorough detail why I believe that in the book. And there's a whole lot devoted to that, but that would certainly be the perfect scenario. Now, I've been involved with researchers who were aimed at trying to collect a specimen. I'm not sure that I believe anymore that it's within the citizen scientist's grasp. I think it's probably best. It's a catch-22. It's a real conundrum because you have these institutions, again, that we defer like authority to, the military. So the government, academia, or scientific institutions, and we want them to be looking into this the way that we are, because I don't have a degree. I'm not an academic. I'm not a professional. I wish that there were academics looking into it as
well. And you don't have the funding, right? I mean, you get the government funding behind it. You can have a team out there for however long you need,
but you need a starting point, And so what's been offered thus far, this huge body of evidence that we've been touching on, it's suggestive and it's subjective, but it's like, well, what is it suggestive of? Either an animal with a foot shaped like that left this track, or a human hoaxed it, and so it depends on, well, who's your audience? Because some of them will go, oh, it can't possibly, there cannot be a Sasquatch. Therefore, there is not a Sasquatch. Therefore, whatever you show me, it has to be hoax, no matter how good it looks. And so there's this circular thing that happens where, and I've had this happen in conversations, many of my colleagues have too, with certain academics or scientists, where you would say, like, I have something I would like you to look at that I think is worthy of analysis in your field. You're an expert. Okay. What do you think you have? Well, we think it's related to the Sasquatch. Like, oh, well, the Sasquatch doesn't exist. There's no, like, okay, well, what would make you think that it might exist? Oh, well, I'd need to see evidence. Like, okay, well, will you look at this? And they'll go, I don't have to look at that because the Sasquatch doesn't exist. Why not? Oh, because there's no evidence. Oh, what about this? Oh, I don't have to look at that. And so many of them I'd ask, like, what if we did establish through some other means? Like, let's say you had a combination of high resolution video of an individual interacting with something. Let's say some kind of like a structure that you built, a bait station, let's say, and it's interacting with it and it's depositing hair, like it reaches in to get food and it deposits hair. and you have footage of this, and then you can take that hair and have it tested and show that it's of a non-human primate, what would that then do? And the answer I've gotten from most of the professionals that said, well, that would probably prompt our institution to launch an effort to collect a specimen. So it's like, whether you start with a specimen or even if you deliver as close to proof without the body itself, it's like all those paths probably lead to someone's going to collect a specimen, likely by lethal means. But I do think at this point, having wrestled with the proposition, especially since, I mean, as long as I've been a researcher for 20 years, I've been thinking about it. But over the last several years, working with individuals who were trying to do that, the more I think that like it's probably better left to the institutions, because who knows what will happen as a consequence of that.
Sure.
And the individual, if an individual chooses that path, like they'll have to deal with probably a lot of unintended consequences.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, as sad as it is, yes, a specimen is necessary, and it could be the case that lethal means will be involved.
Right. Yeah.
It was not going to be me. I carry a camera. That way I can shoot at anything. I can shoot at everything that moves and nobody gets hurt. You know what I mean? So.
Right. Yeah, no, I hear you. I think it's funny in a way, because I don't know that it really matters that we know that we can prove it exists. And so like there was a gray whale, I think it was this past week, maybe 2 weeks ago, that showed up off Nantucket in the Atlantic. And they thought the gray whales were extinct in the Atlantic. They know they're alive and well in the Pacific, but it showed up there for the first time in like 200 years. And I think we have this concept as humans that we're the stewards of nature. I think it's kind of a religious concept, right? I don't think nature, not that we're not part of nature, but nature outside of us thinks of us as their steward, right? It's like that gray whale doesn't care if we know it exists or not. I don't think Sasquatch cares if we know if it exists or not. So it's like for our own knowing and experience, we want to like prove it exists. And I think it's a noble thing on our part. It's a noble human thing to want to like steward nature and to think, okay, maybe they're troubled and we can do some things. Like we did the condors, right? The condors, California condors were down, I think, the 13, and they were able to bring them back, and now they're in the wild. I think they're in the Grand Canyon now, if I remember right. So it's a noble thing, but it's not that American, really. If you think of consent of the governed, it's like, well, Sasquatch hasn't consented to be governed. He doesn't care. Like us knowing the way it existing doesn't, coincide.
There's a few different ways to look at it. I mean, I do think we are the stewards of the planet solely because we have to save it from ourselves to some degree. I mean, like when you look at all the leaps and bounds that we've made in terms of like conservation of things like, delisting the grizzly bear, because it was on the endangered species list, and like what a win for conservation that we got their numbers to a point that they're no longer, well, it's like, they had to be listed because of what humans did, and so it's like, yes, our progress in conserving these species is saving them from ourselves, so it's like, well, we're only the stewards because we're also the threat. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, sure. If you're driving and your friend's in the passenger seat, like I'm the steward of this person because we could get to the destination, or I could drive us both off a cliff in a moment's notice. And so it is up to me to like keep it between the ditches. You know what I mean? So I do think that now I've heard people try to make arguments like, what if they're endangered? And oh my God, what if they need our protection? It's like, well, that's a compelling argument. I kind of doubt that would be the case, but maybe, I mean, we don't know. First of all, we don't even know that they exist. And so maybe they are endangered, maybe they're not. But at least like you'd have to establish like, okay, well, what are their habitat requirements and how do we ensure that there's enough habitat? Because there is habitat loss and fragmentation, and that affects populations, or in certain areas, they log a vast area and then they replant it all with a single tree species because it yields the most sort of board feet of lumber. And so there's plenty of places you could look at on Google Earth or drive by that look like a sea of green forest, but because they're a monoculture forest, one species, they have the nutritional density of a desert. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
like, yeah, it looks like a
Yeah.
forest, but nothing's living in there,
Sure.
And so I do think that there's an argument that they need recognition for, I mean, on a personal level, I would love to see witnesses be validated or claimants be validated, researchers be vindicated, things of that nature. Because, man, I've seen people go through it with their own claims.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen
Right.
people get disbelieved and insulted by their spouses, other loved ones, their friends, people at their work, where it's like, man, if these things exist, I would certainly like to see that person be validated, I mean, I was in a woman's home once who, and I referenced this like briefly in this anecdote in the book, who had a very close unobstructed sighting in a vehicle. And as she's described, I'd interviewed her before on the phone, but now I'm sitting in her house and having this discussion. And the whole time she's visibly stirred, like trying to relive this moment. And her husband's laughing at her the whole time. And he's like, oh, you did not, you saw a bear. Come on, and she just looked at me and she goes, and I was like thinking like, what an asshole. She just looked at me and she's like, he's been doing this for years. Just defeated looking,
Right.
And I just thought like, God, I hope that guy's outside one day and one of these things like picks him up and shakes him or something,
He
so
gets hit with the rock. It's a direct hit that time.
So there's all kinds of like selfish reasons too. But I do think as long as we're the biggest threat or one of the biggest threats to species being able to thrive in their habitats, we are kind of by virtue of that, like the stewards, because I mean, that's the funny thing about like science or progress is like it can go either way, right? Like we might unlock all the secrets of material reality and bring about utopia, or we could just have global nuclear war and wipe out everything. It's like it could go either way. And so as long as there's a species, I mean, you think about the things that are affected by environmental things, things that are affected by like the proximity to a volcano or fault lines and tectonic activity or landslides or avalanches or, whatever sort of climate related things. So there's species who are kind of on the brink in certain places where one natural disaster could wipe them out or severely impact them. Like the whole planet could be wiped out because of the psyche of a single individual. Like a single person in power could launch nukes and then it starts mutual. And so it's like, if we're the only species that on the psyche of one of our individual could wipe out everything, then we're kind of responsible to make sure shit stays together. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I've had some naturalists on the show before, and I've asked them, and actually most of them are very good about it, because I think it's usually people that live in the city that thinks of us as apart from nature, right? There tends to be this like, oh, there's the natural world and then there's us. And I've always thought that was weird. I'm like, we're natural too. The only real difference is scale, right? A beaver builds a dam. Well, we build a dam and, clog up the Colorado River and make Lake Powell and, change the environment, completely. But I think I don't say that to say we don't have responsibility, right? But I don't know, like species have gone extinct throughout the whole creation, right? I mean, there's dinosaurs, there's everything goes, the ones that like, with the eagles, almost went extinct because, and some other birds because of, I think it was DDT, it was different things that was making their eggs unviable. So if we know about it and something we're actively doing, then absolutely. If it's just natural progressions and they happen to go extinct one day, then they happen to go extinct. I wouldn't want them to. It's funny because I'm the exact opposite. When I heard that DNA study came out, and it sounded very definitive, like when it happened, I was like, oh, it's been proven. And like, I felt so deflated. Like the world felt so much smaller that day when I heard it. And I was like, oh, maybe I don't, I love like the videos. I love looking into it, but I'm like, oh man, I didn't know that I actually want it to be solved. Like,
but think about all the mysteries that would come as a consequence of discovery. Like, first of all, if someone got a specimen, no matter how, if they found a dead one, if they hit it with a truck, if it, tripped and fell and broke its neck, or, if someone shot it, whatever the case may be.
Sure. Yeah.
Let's say that happened in North Georgia, where I grew up, Southern Appalachia. all right, you have this one individual like you can produce to the world. Like, it's not going to be nationwide recognition. It is not going to be continent wide. I guarantee you that what will happen first will be that people will say, look, apparently there was something to this. Maybe these Asian apes made it into North America, and they seem to have gotten as far as Southern Appalachia, and a tiny number of them held on to existence there. But there's no reason to think that they're in the Rockies, the Cascades, the Ouachitas, the Ozarks, on and on and on. And so you would still have the Yeoman's work, the hard work of trying to prove established populations in these other places. And then it would be a matter of like, what's their life history? How long do they live? What are their interbirth intervals? There's all these mysteries that would still, in my opinion, take us decades to find out, because they won't be any easier to pursue or predict or find just because we know that they're out there. And then there'll be these mysteries of like, all right, well, let's talk about images, for example. Like, can you film, how does a mother interact with its young? Like, it might take people years to film that. I mean, you think about something like the snow leopard, which lives in basically a treeless environment. How many years it took for people to get quality footage or extended footage of snow leopards. It took a very long time. And so you take an animal, and you can film those from miles away because there's no obstructions. You get a zoom lens and you're on this mountain, and you're looking way down across this other mountain. And even then the snow leopards, they're so elusive. Now you put yourself in a forest where you can't see more than 30 yards, at the most. It's a different. So I think there'll still be so many mysteries that will still take so long to get to the bottom of, even if we know tomorrow that they do exist.
Well, there's plenty of mysteries out there, in general, but yeah, I wonder, with it. So I know you're a proponent of the ape, right? Was it Gigantopithecus, like basically coming over, maybe some, relative of it.
Yes.
There's also the theory of, like a relic hominid or something, like another type of, this is actually, it is kind of weird. This is of human history. Like, there was usually other, people or types of people around. There's Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, all the other homos around. What do you think of those theories?
Well, the term that gets used very often is relict hominoid. And so anything that's ape-ish or ape-like is a hominoid. And then within that you have hominids. Within that you have hominin. And so cascading down, it's like all hominins are hominids, but not all hominids are hominids. And all hominins and hominids are hominoids, but not all hominoids are hominids. Or so, for example, if we look at the apes, humans, chimps, orangutans, gorillas, gibbons. Gibbons are a lesser ape, so they are hominoids. They are not hominids. So if we go to hominids, then you have, humans, gorillas, chimps, orangs, and then hominin, you have just the humans. And so hominins, like fossil hominins, would be things like Neanderthals, Heidelbergensis, Floresiensis, Homo erectus, etc. Things that are in that lineage that led to Homo sapiens, essentially. Whereas the other great apes would be hominids, and then other, broader outside of that would be hominoids. But again, they are all still hominoids in that sort of like, like all M&Ms are chocolates, but not all chocolates are M&Ms. You know what I mean? And so everything, when you look at the eyewitness testimony, like the things that emerge, because again, we can't observe a Sasquatch, obviously, or we'd be having a different conversation, but you could, let's say, observe physical characteristics or behaviors as reported by observers, and then you can infer, what sort of thing people are seeing. And so everything that differentiates the human lineage is just absent in what people report with the Sasquatch. And so from the physical evidence, like, what we interpret as like the shape of the hands and the functioning of the digits, they don't seem to have the same degree of opposition of the thumb and this big thinner pad of prominence. So they seem to have different hands. We discussed in the ways that the feet are different. These other proportions are different. They're never associated with any sort of material culture. Fabricating tool use might be as primitive as like they throw rocks and wield sticks occasionally. as do other apes, but they don't seem to control fire, anything of that nature. So everything is much more in line with the other great apes. And then, I think Gigantopithecus is the best ancestral candidate that we know of. I mean, first of all, the fossil record is so wildly incomplete. I've heard estimates of things like we only have 1% of all the species that ever lived, or 5%, or some people are more generous and say 10%. But even still, it just shows you that like most things were never fossilized, and so we have no idea. But with these two ape genera that were within this clade, they were once thought to be the same genus, but now they've been sort of split. You got lumpers and splitters. So the oldest form was called Indopithecus, and that's 8.6 million years ago. And that's going to be a little bit more Western Asia, like the Potwar Plateau of Pakistan and the Sawalik Hills of India. And then the younger form, Gigantopithecus, is a little over 2 million years ago to the youngest bones that are preserved are about 80 to 100,000 years ago in northern Vietnam. And so if you were to look at it on a map, it'd be like Western Asia, again, Pakistan, India, all the way through Vietnam, many parts of Southeast Asia, China, and then there's even mandible fragments that have been recovered from Java, so as far south as Indonesia. And we know that Gigantopithecus, for each of those genera, each genus, we're only aware of one species each. Now, a genus will produce a radiation of species. So Homo is a great example, like you brought up, that we are aware of. At any given time, you go back not too long ago, and there are many different species within the Homo genus that shared the planet at the same time, contemporaneously. Ursus would be a great example. You have black bears and brown bears and polar bears and sloth bears and sun bears and moon bears. There's all sorts of different bear species across the planet that are all within that same genus. Right. So both of those genera belong to a clade, and a clade will produce multiple genera. So it's like, well, if a clade would produce multiple genera, we only know of about 2, and each genus will produce multiple species, but we only know of 1 each. It's like, how many other forms of giant ape, Asian apes were there? There are probably a lot more than just Indopithecus giganteus and then later Gigantopithecus blacki. There's probably other. Some of them might have been more Sasquatch-like, but at least with Gigantopithecus blacki, we know that they lived alongside our genus Homo for well over 1 million years. They lived in very closed canopy forests with dense understories. They had a very wide-ranging, broad diet that was very, very diverse. They would have been, again, massive apes. And so in a lot of ways, their preferred habitat, their preferred diet, and, there's a major overlap with the Sasquatch. And the fact that they lived alongside us in Asia and our ancestors. So it's like, when I look at that, I think, well, the Sasquatch phenomenon's already happened once. The question is like, to make that, like, to make some other thing work, you have to make a lot more assumptions. So I've heard people say like, oh, I think they're closely related to humans. Maybe there's some form of human that abandoned tools and fire and then regressed and became large and hair covered, where it's like no species has really done that. And it wouldn't be advantageous, especially since with tool use and fire, that changed our physiology. It changed our gut, it changed our digestive system, it changed our brain case, it changed so many things. It'd be hard to revert. So you could take any one of those near humans and say, yeah, but if it did this and 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 this, it could be the Sasquatch, right? It's like, well, yeah, I guess, maybe if I had been born in the 1940s, I could have ended up in the Beatles. We could talk, but that's not what happened. So with Gigantopithecus, I only have to ask 2 questions. Like, did they come into North America, which a huge amount of North American mammals came here from Asia, and vice versa. There's plenty of things that originated in the Americas that are now only in Asia that came from North America. But, bears came here from Asia. Big cats came here from Asia, the cougar. Wolverines came here from Asia. There's a whole host of humans came here from Asia, the indigenous people. And so many of the animals that were in the same like faunal complex that Gigantopithecus was came to North America and are still around. And so that's the only 2 questions. Like, did they come into North America? Are they still around? If either of those is yes, I think, well, there's your Sasquatch. And so of all the available fossil options, that's like an ancestor, potential ancestor, that one to me is already like they're the right place at the right time and they're the right size. They have the right diet. Like everything sort of lines up to go, man, it's not a big leap at all to think that the modern Sasquatch is the relative of or the descendant of that clade or one of those two genera or that genus of apes.
So let's transition with some shots. So just rapid fire questions. So first thought, they're going to be the hard hitting. This is the hard hitting questions portion of this show. So you ready?
Certainly.
All right. True or false? When a Sasquatch retires from lurking, they resign to a cabin in the woods with their supermodel wife and 2 kids.
False.
That was always my working. And whenever we'd hike in the night, we'd see a random cabin. We're like, yeah, Sasquatch probably lives there. Worst advice you ever received?
All of it was about the book. All of it.
Really?
And it was all, yes. And I know you're looking for rapid fire questions, but during the process of writing, because I've been studying this intently, obsessively with all my time and energy for a very long time.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I've traveled a lot. I've interviewed many hundreds of claimants. I've networked with like so many other researchers and investigators. And, I have a perspective built on all that. And so friends that were trying to be helpful would connect me to people in the literary world and say, oh, you should talk to this person because they know about, writing, publishing, et cetera. And those people who didn't know anything about the subject or related disciplines like evolutionary biology, the biology and ecology of apes, or any of these things, would come to me and they'd say like, well, first of all, you have to ditch all this technical language. No one knows what any of this means. And I was like, but no, this is the language. And if you read books, popular science nonfiction about mammals, let alone apes, like these are the terms. Like, no one will understand that. You got to dumb it down. People aren't smart enough to understand this. You're going to go over everyone's heads. And I was like, well, I don't underestimate the audience the way you clearly do. Or people would say, what is this about? Like, why are you talking about the Sasquatch? What's your story? What's the scariest thing that ever happened to you? And I would be like, this isn't about me. It's not a memoir. This is not about me. And, oh, well, no one's going to read this. No one's going to read this. You need to tell your story. Like, hasn't anything ever funny ever happened to you? And it's like, so the worst advice I'd ever received, and I've had it happen from television production companies. I speak about this the way that I speak about it. And I've been speaking publicly about this subject since 2007. I've done, I can't tell you how many interviews. And I've never had no one's ever said like, hey, you're too, impenetrable prose or something. Like, people are very receptive. And so I'd have TV producers say the same thing, like, hey, you need to dumb all this down. And I was like, you are making the fool's mistake of underestimating the intelligence of the general public and underestimating your audience. And so if you've read the book, like I put that in the preface. I basically said, like, yes, there's going to be a lot of technical language in here, and I'm going to define terms where I think it's appropriate to do so. But one thing I will never do is underestimate you, the reader, ever.
Sure.
And so the worst advice I've ever gotten in a nutshell is always that, like, I should alter what I think is the proper way to address this topic because people are too stupid to understand it, which I think is the dumbest thing that any of these professionals could make.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Amen. I do, though, think it's a fun book, like My Sasquatch Memoir or something. Like, maybe, down the future, the future
maybe
line.
One day I could tell some wild. I've met some wild people, man. There's one story that comes to mind. I won't belabor it now, but maybe for a future thing. It's like we even had one guy that was a liar, kind of a yarn spinner, but he had actually tried to get out of some of his claims, basically tried to fake his own death. Which is like, that's pretty interesting, So maybe I'll tell that story in a book one day.
Yeah, really. That'll be a good one. Bigfoot versus Mothman. Who you got?
The Sasquatch.
Sasquatch. I mean, Mothman can maybe fly away and have the high ground.
Well, this is going to... I'm going to be firmly seated in my beautiful glass house with plenty of stones to throw. But like I I don't think, I think the Mothman is a psychological phenomenon, and there's probably not a biological reality. And I know that makes me sound like such a hypocrite, like,
Well,
at least with the Sasquatch, you've got centuries worth of claims and a mountain of physical evidence associated with. There's just not that as much with the Mothman, but
sure.
I guess all things considered, if they were both biologically real, then maybe the flight would give an advantage. But I'd still have to go with the Sasquatch for me.
I'm from West Virginia, so we have a warm place in our heart, and maybe it should be cold because bridges.
Very
collapsed,
cool. What part of West Virginia are you from?
I was born in Morgantown.
Okay, very cool.
So my family's up like the northern panhandle. A lot of my grandmother, my grandfather's passed away now, but they live in West Alexander, Pennsylvania. But just right on the border. They're about 20 minutes from Wheeling. So
very cool. There's so many Sasquatch reports from West Virginia, which is really remarkable when you consider how low the population is of people. Sure. Mm-hmm. And so you have fewer observers, but generating so many reports. Like, I think that's a really significant thing to pay attention to. So,
very cool. Next time I go, I'll ask you after the show. But next time I go, maybe I can do some wandering during the day because I'll get lost at night. The show will end because I won't be around anymore. Well, awesome. So next one, have you, Cliff, and Bobo ever considered starting a band? And if so, what would be the name?
We should. I play music. Cliff plays music. Bobo does not, so we can make Bobo the singer. What would the name be? It's a good question. We'd have to make some kind of funny Sasquatch name. Like, one of the popular names that was used in Southern Appalachia, Booger is a derivative of boogie, like boogeyman. Mm-hmm. And so very often in the Southeast, they were called like wood boogers or woolly boogers. So I think it'd have to be something booger oriented because that's pretty damn funny,
that would be a good one. That sounds like a good band name.
The Booger Boys or something like that. You know what I mean? Booger looking.
Yeah, very good, very good. Have you ever witnessed anything inexplicable
beyond Sasquatch related things?
Yeah.
No, but I would love to. I'm fascinated by experiences of high strangeness, and I think part of the reason I'm so fascinated is because I have not had, but I would absolutely love to, certainly.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think I think they go hand in hand to a degree, because what I love about all of them is the stories and like the testimony, the witness stuff, because unless you don't pay attention, it's so hard to just throw it out. Oh, they're hoaxing, or they're just every ghost story, it's just the brain. It's like you actually start to go, no, it doesn't make sense when you actually talk to the people and listen to all of it. Like, it's fascinating in its own. But
absolutely,
I'm with you. So we had one viewer question on this. So Mike and Dale asks, hey bro, I don't know, maybe this is my brother, very familiar sounding. Is there more than one Sasquatch? Oh, and if so, how can I submit my dad for DNA testing?
Well, they would have to be, right? They'd have to be a population if they do exist. That's, I think, one of the unfortunate things that the media has always done is portray it as a singular character, kind of like Zeus or the Hulk or Frankenstein or something, like this one immortal thing that just walks. Because I've had people respond to that too when they're asking me about me interviewing witnesses, and like, I grew up in North Georgia and moved to the Pacific Northwest, and they'd be like, so they've seen him in Georgia and they've seen him in Washington, and I'm like, no, it's not a him, it's not a singular one. So yes, more than one. If you think your dad might be one, submit a DNA sample. He might be the key to unlocking the whole mystery. So Mike and Dale, they must be brothers if they have one dad.
Right. Well, it's just one name, Mike and Dale. So, but but yeah, we'll see. We'll submit dad one of these days. And then very last question for our shots portion: favorite podcast, and why is it Writers Drinking Whiskey?
Oh man, I listen to a lot of podcasts. Of course, I have to do the standard thing of like, my favorite podcast is Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo, available on all major podcasting platforms. That one is I listen to the most because I'm on every call and I edit them. And so beyond that, I mean, there's so many good ones. And beyond all the like scientifically oriented ones that I listen to, which are a lot, I really love funny ones and I really love music podcasts. So I have to say one that I really loved because it was so absurd was called Beyond Yacht Rock. And it was the guys that used to do the Yacht Rock web series, and they sort of coined the term yacht rock for that genre of music. They did a podcast for a few years where they would create new arbitrary sort of genres of music and play examples of it. And so they did one that was like called Divorce Core, where it was like the records made by like Phil Collins or Steve Perry, all these people after their big public messy divorces. And so it was a music podcast, but it was so funny. It's like one of the funniest. So maybe I'll put that up as a favorite.
Very good. Awesome. Then let's transition back now, just, very specifically to the book and kind of the writing process of it. So I wonder then, because you've done so much public speaking, you've done the podcast and the editing and the writing the songs, I presume, from the time, I think you mentioned as well. How did you translate that then into writing the book?
It's very hard because for me, because I've discussed it for so long in so many different settings to so many different audiences, whether in the beginning it was an audience of one or two of my friends as I was trying to explain what I was interested in, why this phenomenon interested me, what I was learning, because I had so many friends that were musicians, for example. So if you're trying to get a concept across to someone and they're not well read in the biological literature or scientific literature, it's like, well, let me pull some analogies or make some metaphors that I know this person well enough that, you're always watching people and you can see when they kind of, when you're like, okay, I've lost them. I got to reel them back in. Like, I go, okay, wait, think of it like this. And that even translates to big audiences, like if you're giving a presentation at a conference, like you can still watch people and see like where you've got them and they're with you or whether you're starting to lose them a little bit. But then, so I've done this so many times and I thought, oh, this will be easy. Like all I have to do is commit all the things that I've been saying to a permanent form. But then the difficulty was like, oh man, how do you say this one time, one way for everyone forever? I don't have the benefit. Right. I'm not going to get their feedback and go, okay, well, here's another way to think about it. Like I need to say, here's how you need to think about this. And it has to be as wide reaching and permanent as possible. And then you realize like all the old adages of like, the best way to make something for no one is to try to make it for everyone,
Sure.
And then things like, what the amateur loves, the expert endures. So if you're only aiming at like the neophytes, the people that just walked in the door and they don't know anything. And, if I was following that sort of like dumb it down advice, then I would lose a lot of people. And then if I was only speaking to the people that were already devoted students of the subject, all the amateurs would go like, wait, where are we? Like, where's the starting point? And so that was the real struggle of like trying to make it accessible and as precise as possible, to make sure that like there's no ambiguity here. I don't want to be overly technical or superfluous or seeming like I'm, being over wordy for the sake of being too wordy. I would rather just like, no, I'm saying this in a way that I think is the most accurate and precise way for me to express it, where each one of these words, I don't think that there's a better word here. Could there be a shorter one at times? Sure. Is it a better one? I don't think so. And that was a laborious writing the same line over and over and over again. Because then when you think about those different audiences, like the amateurs, the experts, the non-scientific, the people who are not scientifically sort of like rooted or well-read versus that, it's like you could take any line and say, is there a better way to say this? And the answer is always yes. And it's because it's like, well, better for who? There's a better way to say it for these people, and there's a better way to say it for those people. And so it's trying to commit to, okay, I think this is the best way to say it in general for everyone, everywhere, for all time. But also the dread of like, oh man, it's a commitment, like you can't, it's not like a blog where you can go edit it. It's like, no, it's done,
Right.
And so that to me was the hardest part, was all the paralysis by analysis of like, I know what I want to say. How do I want to say it in a permanent form? Because I'm so used to living in a world of conversation where we can cover so much more ground. And if I say something that leaves you like, oh, tell me more. Or if you're like, dude, I don't know, what are you talking about? I have the chance to keep reiterating, versus in a book, you don't get that. So that was really, could be terrifying at times,
Sure. Well, it's very common anyways, right? Because it's like, I'll be writing, for a fiction audience, but I'll work on a line and write some poetry too, but I'm very, very specific on the language, at all times. And I'll realize I've gone through the editing process and changed that line like 3 or 4 times, changed it back. And it's almost the 80-20% rule, right? It's like, no, this is actually good enough. You keep tweaking and you lose something here, you gain something here. And there's not always the perfect way, because it's going to go by just who the reader is, right? Who the audience is. That's going to say if it's perfect or not. So you got to get it close enough that everyone can grasp it, and then hopefully good enough that some people find it perfect. And so it is a bit of alchemy, associated with the process. So with the creative process in general, was it just kind of getting down, waking up every morning writing, or the discipline to it, or was there anything you did creative process wise, right? Is there calling upon the muses, the lighting candles, listening to a certain music, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, it's more discipline. I would say that it's more intention than inspiration, just because a lot of it was things that I'd already thought through and worked through and communicated for many years. But then obviously there were things that I sort of, discovered in the process that I was like, oh, I have to get this down now. So my routine would be, because at the time, I was handling a couple of different jobs, both sort of like part-time, and one of which is sort of like commission only. So it's not like I had to ever be anywhere or do anything. It's like, hey, if I contribute to this, I make commission or whatever, and doing the podcast full time and still doing field research as much as I always did. And at that time I was on the board of directors of an organization that was a Sasquatch related organization. So there was a whole lot of stuff. Like once the sun came up, my phone was going to ring, or I was going to get texts or emails. Things had to be done. So I found like I would get up and write from like 4:30 or 5 o'clock until 7:30 or 8 a.m. because like I have no obligations and no one else is awake, and it's going to be like, hey, right. I need you to do this. I need this. And so that was where the bulk of it was written, is like those hours in the morning. And then throughout the day, I always had like notes going on my phone. And if an idea came, I was like, oh, I have to get this down now. Because you know how it is. You start to get an idea and then someone's like, oh, hey, can I borrow you for 5 minutes? And then you get back to, and you're like, I know I had an idea, but I don't know what it was now. So I tried to constantly, like, as those little moments of inspiration, oh, I've got to touch on it. And here's another way I should say it. And jotting those things down. But to me, the real work was all like, I can't write once the day started because there's too many distractions. And they're not distractions like, oh, I don't feel like it. Distractions like, no, I have to respond to this person. I'm obligated. So that window of time in the morning when like no one expects anything from me is like where the bulk of all that was done,
Sure. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then, so I know there was one other question. I just can't read my notes here. So that's actually what I wanted to ask. What makes this book different than all the other books in the field?
Hopefully a lot of things. I mean, number one, like I said, I tried to make it the most complete overview that I possibly could without being superficial, without not just like touching on, names and dates and this happened. Like it's a pretty deep dive. And, I was very honored that a number of people came to that conclusion. People that I knew that are really devoted students of the subject who've also read everything. They were kind enough to, write reviews or reach out or say on their own platforms, like, hey, this is the most comprehensive work. So I think from there, if you wanted to read about like eyewitness accounts, then there are books that are solely about that. Or if you wanted to read about inferred foot morphology, there are entire books solely, mostly on that. But if you want an overview of everything, a lot of that's in there. And then, like I said, in each chapter, there's quite a bit of like original, like things that no one else has ever posited or hypothesized, or connections no one else had ever made. So there is a lot of that that's original that I think sets it apart. But I guess more than anything, I think it is, I'm doing my very best to be as neutral. It's hard because, again, like, do I believe it's possible? Yes. Like, people would say, do you believe that Sasquatch exists? Like, well, I believe it's possible.
Sure.
Because, it's hard to say that, like, I believe they definitely do. Even if I'm convinced, belief is to accept a statement or a proposition as true.
Right.
But, I go to every length to constantly make the caveats of, like, we don't know that they exist yet, if they exist. And, I try not to necessarily always refer to people as witnesses, because that assumes that there's something to witness. So I try to say, well, these people make claims and they're claimants, et cetera. So I do think that I'm not asking the staunch skeptic or the cynic or even the total newcomer, I'm not asking them to, accept the proposition that Sasquatches do exist. What I'm trying to say is, let's look at the totality of everything that's associated with this. And then from these two perspectives, that either these animals do exist, or in lieu of that, it's all somehow us. It's the product of the human mind, voluntary or involuntary. And like every step of the way, which seems like the more likely explanation for this bit of evidence, that bit of evidence, these testimony, you do statistical analyses of claims and certain patterns emerge, and they have ecological trends within them that, and some of those things were recorded before we even understood the other living apes, and they're congruent with the other apes. And like, well, ain't that a happy coincidence unless some of this is real? So I hope I'm presenting it as fairly as possible and allowing a reader to come to their own conclusions. But, I think, of course, people will go, oh, well, Pruitt's a believer, and therefore it's clear that he believes. And so I'm sure people have that interpretation, but I do hope it's as balanced as I could make it, and certainly as thorough and comprehensive and as deep a dive as I'm capable of doing in a single book.
Right. Well, it's funny. It's two things kind of struck to my mind. One came up earlier, and I forgot to even mention it. But one is, I don't love the word believe. Like, I know my family or sometimes go, oh, why do you believe? I'm like, it's not so much that I believe. It's not like a religion. It's not like it's a belief like in a god or something. I think Bigfoot could be real, based on like different things I've seen, and just I try very hard to really be intellectually humble, and so that I can like say anything, and I'll try to just accept where that's coming from. I may decide I don't, but instead of just going, oh, UFOs aren't real, or oh, Bigfoot isn't real, oh, this isn't, it's because actually when you look at it, right, we go, oh, dark matter or dark energy. That's just all it is scientists saying they don't know what it is. And it's just 95% of the universe is dark matter or dark energy. We don't know what that is. Okay, you're just saying there's 95% that you don't know what it is. So so the belief, it's like, oh no, I think it could be. And as you've talked, what keeps coming to my head, and maybe this is because I mentioned my wife loving those like murder shows, is like when they're looking for the murderer and they'll put like the victim on the board or whatever it is, and you see all those strings kind of going, all the things, how it goes across, like, oh, this is who it is, and they finally circle them at the end. There's all those pieces of evidence just adding up, and you go, oh, okay, this is where we're at. That pictures came to my head a couple of times as you've been talking.
And that's really like the point of the book for me too, is to lay everything out in a single work for that reason. Because people will often ask, like, well, what's the best piece of evidence? Like, what one thing? And that's a difficult proposition, because you really do have to see that picture. An analogy would be like, to borrow and sort of like modify a friend's analogy, because he used this sort of puzzle analogy. But I think it's so complex because you have to see the layers of things that are nested together. So let's say you had like a 2,000 piece puzzle, and the picture is like a grassy field, and in the field there's a blanket, and on the blanket there's a wicker basket, and in the wicker basket there's a puppy. Like, well, which puzzle piece will tell you what that is? It's like none of them. Because you pull one and you're like, oh, this is just grass, oh, this is just a blanket, oh, this is just a wicker basket, oh, this is just a puppy. It's like, no, you have to see the way all these things relate to go, okay, I see what's the totality of what the image that's emerging here. Right. And you can get there from, these eyewitness testimonies and these sort of the multimedia evidence, the physical evidence, the trace evidence, on and on. And it, like, they all paint a pretty coherent picture, but it's sort of I heard there's a great quote. I used it in the book that a woman, Cy Montgomery, wrote this excellent book about tigers. I'm kind of fascinated with tigers because they're terrifying and awesome. She wrote a book called The Spell of the Tiger. And she had said, when you're trying to get an understanding of these animals, the way that they're perceived by the people who live in these places. She wrote it about the Sundarbans, which is like the tiger death capital of the world. These tidal estuary marshes, they think the salinity of the water promotes a little additional aggression in the tigers, and they eat people on a regular basis. And these people work in these swamps, and so it's just part of life. Is like, you might get eaten by a tiger, and everyone knows someone who has been. But because tigers are very elusive and very rare, and she said, like, each one of these encounters is so brief for the locals. And so they're only getting these little glimpses and insights. And so the picture that they paint is not like a scientist's line drawing. It's like a pointillist painting, each dot like vivid and glowing. And that's sort of where we're at with the Sasquatch, not just the encounter testimonies, but all the evidence. It's like, you could look at it as a random series of dots, or you could sort of see the constellations starting to emerge, and
sure.
So I agree with you. Yeah. Like, I couldn't say like any one thing is going to prove to anyone thus far that they should take this seriously, or at least see the possibility. But the overview of all of it, it'd be hard to go, man, that's just all baloney. Like, no, it's harder to dismiss than that,
Sure. Absolutely. Has there ever been any reports of you bringing up the tigers eating people? Has there ever been any reports of? I mean, I guess you wouldn't get the eyewitness testimony of the Sasquatch killing them, but of anything like that, like a Sasquatch taking someone away, or anything. Because I figure if they get aggressive, sometimes it'd be easy enough for a 9-foot-tall gorilla to dispatch somebody pretty quickly and take the body away to where it's never found. But has there ever been any suggestion of that? Or
well, there are these sort of archetypal motifs that are associated with the Sasquatch that, like, they're the abductors of humans, and mostly women and children. And that's a through line through not only like in certain indigenous oral traditions and folkloric representations, but even early like non-natives and European settlers talking about the wild man, the mountain devil, the woolly booger, etc. But then you dig deeper and you see, like, that's also true of all these archetypal wild men that we talked about earlier, the fawn, the centaur, the satyr, etc. But it's also true of, and I lay it out in the book, analogous mammals like bears and tigers and gorillas, and the way that they're represented in various oral traditions or even, beliefs associated with them. Bears are in North America, and they're in Asia. There's bears in Japan, there's bears in various parts of Asia, Eurasia, etc. And that's probably, there's a crucial portion of like human culture and the evolution of human history that one of the earlier religions is arctolatry, it's bear worship. And so, we've got a rich mythology about bears, and it's commonly associated with bears that they like abduct women as mates or wives. So it's not simply just like a food resource, that there's like this kind of sexual overlay based on it. The same beliefs are associated with tigers, Siberian tigers by the Udjai people and a number of other peoples in that part of Siberia. And then as you go down into other parts of Asia where they survive, parts of India, and the same beliefs about gorillas. And you see that manifested, that sort of archetypal motif. I mean, look at King Kong. What does he do? Like, he abducts the woman and carries her off, and so it's like an ancient sort of fear that we project on many animals, not just apes. But you can imagine with apes, like, the more like us superficially they are, the more probably that fear becomes real. So of course that's part of the the narrative, let's say, but there's no real modern or contemporary reports of them actually abducting, women and children. And so they've become a scapegoat, I think, for a lot of missing persons cases in some people's minds, that because people do venture into wild areas and they do disappear and are never found under oftentimes very mysterious circumstances, where you would think, in some of these reports where it's like, well, someone had, they were backpacking and they had a big metal frame backpack and boots and a camera, and like, well, whatever happens to them, decomposition or their clothes, like somebody should find those boots or that metal frame backpack. We knew. And so cases like that where no one's ever found, many people go, oh, the Sasquatch got him, So in a way, it's a bit of a scapegoat or a boogeyman. And is it possible? Well, like certainly if they exist, it is possible. I mean, apes, if we look at other apes, like chimpanzees hunt and eat colobus monkeys. Orangutans, under pressure, because they're primarily fruit eaters, but they have a more broad diet that their primary food is fruit. If for whatever reason there's an impact in their resource, whether that's a seasonal impact or something due to human progress, they'll actually opportunistically hunt and eat slow lorises, baby gibbons, which are other primates there. So it's not unheard of that So it's possible, but it seems like when you look at what people describe in their own encounters, like the lore or the legends, the folklore includes, they take people. But when you talk to people who had an encounter, well, like you said, we wouldn't expect, there wouldn't be survivors, so we can't talk with it.
Right, exactly.
But it's like 99% of the time the thing just runs away from the human at first sight. And so I don't think that they're necessarily, if they exist, that we should be worried about being on the menu too much,
Right.
Hopefully.
Sure. Yeah, I know. Yeah, hopefully for you, because you're out looking for him. There's a podcast. I'm just trying to remember the title. Sasquatch Chronicles. Yep. And he brings people on and just tells a story. And that one I like to listen. Sometimes I'm working out, I'll throw one of those on and listen. And I think it was I'll link it just so that anyone can find it. But I think it was 873, the number 873 episode, where a guy had an encounter. He said he shot it and things on it, but it was interesting because it's just how he was an older gentleman, just how terrified he sounded on it. He was just like, oh, I was so terrified, and he had a handgun, and he said he shot it.
I remember the story, but was that Arkansas?
I think it might have been Arkansas.
Yeah.
He had. I would guess so.
Very agitated.
Right.
Yeah, he said he was getting into a bloodlust. I remember the guy said, yeah.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
The host of that podcast, Wes, I consider him a good friend. He's a super nice guy, very helpful, because he's probably got the biggest podcast ever in terms of the Sasquatch subject. And so we had a lot of mutual friends, and then I was doing Bigfoot and Beyond. I'd reached out to Wes because he had already been doing his podcast for quite a while and just wanted some advice. I think the first time we talked on the phone, it was like 6 hours, which was crazy. He's such a good dude. He's been so generous and kind to us. And so, yeah, I definitely, people should go check that podcast out for sure.
Yeah, that's a really great one. I love how he just kind of gets people to tell the story and just kind of, inserts and keeps it moving as it can go. But that was a really cool. That was a really cool. I was listening to that the other day when I was working out, and that's exactly it. I remember the bloodlust. He's like, yeah, he's working himself into a bloodlust, and
for sure.
Awesome. So then I think if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could read us something from the book.
Oh, for sure. Let's see here. Maybe the introduction would be a good place to start, because it's brief, and that way I won't bore people to death too much, and maybe it will entice them to want to read more of it.
Very good.
So if you're good with it, I'll do that.
Absolutely.
Hopefully I don't stumble over this too much. So the quote that I opened the chapter with was from Aaron Klug, the biophysicist, and the quote I pulled from him was, "Human curiosity, the urge to know, is a powerful force and is perhaps the best secret weapon of all in the struggle to unravel the workings of the natural world." So this is the introduction to the book. The introduction is called The Sasquatch Phenomenon. "Mysterious phenomena have captivated humankind for the duration of our existence, beckoning our curiosity and inspiring us to explore. Even in this age of unbridled access to the entirety of human discovery, some phenomena remain enigmatic to us. It's our inherent nature to pursue strange phenomena, first attempting to understand them with our imaginations. In archaic times, we created fantasies about these phenomena and expressed them as narrative stories. In modern times, we continue to use our imaginations to investigate phenomena, though our stories now take the form of scientifically informed hypotheses. Before we can test a hypothesis to arrive at a theory that describes the reality of a phenomenon, we use our imaginative minds to design experiments. This continual process of generating and refining fantasies about the unknown is what leads us toward eventual discovery and understanding. While we've uncovered objective truths about an impressive portion of our planet, our galaxy, and our universe, there are still many phenomena that are not yet understood. Some of these phenomena are prolific, with claims of contact or observation occurring across vast spans of time. The most baffling of these phenomena defy conventional explanations. They have been difficult to pursue and have thus far been nearly impossible to predict with enough accuracy to thoroughly document. These phenomena are often categorized as paranormal. The commonalities across paranormal phenomena are as follows. They have a long history comprising many claimants of experiences. They appear to occur frequently from a bird's eye view of time and space, but are, in truth, remarkably rare. They contain elements that can be correlated to other well-understood phenomena, but also include elements that occur beyond the explored realm of modern science. Finally, these phenomena are paradigm-shifting to the observer, yet easily dismissible to the general public. One such mysterious phenomenon occurs in North America and is colloquially referred to as the Sasquatch or Bigfoot phenomenon. The Sasquatch phenomenon suggests the potential existence of a species of large, unclassified creatures in certain North American forests. This phenomenon comprises two main components: testimonial claims of observations and encounters, and physical traces or items attributed to these creatures as evidence of their reality. The claims constitute the largest component of the Sasquatch phenomenon. The creatures are described, is this going on too long? Do I need to, I know you might.
No, you're fine.
But
Yeah, no worries.
I think there's just a page and a half more. The claims constitute the largest component of the Sasquatch phenomenon. The creatures described by claimants are upright, hair-covered, and often significantly larger than humans. Adult males are reported to stand up to 8 feet in height, while adult females, designated as such due to the presence of visible breasts, typically stand around 6.5 feet tall. They purportedly have broad shoulders from which hang powerful arms that are disproportionately longer than a human's arms. Their legs are said to be disproportionately shorter than a human's. They are uniformly devoid of material culture. Fabricated tools or adornments are absent in the observational testimonies. Sasquatches have never been associated with the practical use or control of fire. They've been observed exploiting a diverse array of plant and animal foods by means of foraging, scavenging, and ambush hunting. Observers have provided detailed testimonies that suggest that Sasquatches are active during both day and night, a pattern called cathemerality. In sum, the reports describe a non-human ape. Claims of non-visual observations or experiences also exist. These describe hearing vocalizations unattributable to known North American mammals or the discovery of large ape-like footprints. Claims of experiencing stone or wood projectiles hurled through the environment in contexts that rule out human aggressors also comprise some of the phenomenon. A more ambiguous subset is made of claims describing percussive sounds, wood on wood or rock on rock, purportedly generated by these animals. The reports of observations and encounters with mystery apes have been documented in North America for as long as the written word has been employed. These written testimonies occur in personal correspondences, journal entries, and early print media, at least as far back as the late 1700s. Many of these reports have only been recently aggregated, and more examples are still being mined from various sources. Prior to the written documentation of these testimonies, indigenous peoples' oral traditions, folklore, and art contain descriptions and depictions of what can be interpreted as encounters with large apes. We cannot know exactly how far back this phenomenon has been described, but we can date the oldest representations of ape-like creatures in North America to at least 1,000 years ago. Such claims continue to persist to this day. The most credible claims conservatively number in the thousands. The general claims number in the tens of thousands. Much rarer than the claims are physical traces and items said to represent evidence of the animals described. The most numerous examples are footprints that have been either cast or photographed. Beyond footprints, impressions attributed to these apes have been documented in the form of handprints and partial body impressions. Physical items attributed to the phenomenon include, but are not limited to, hair, scat, damaged vegetation, damaged or manipulated man-made objects and structures, and nests or bedding sites that appear to have been constructed and used by a large, dexterous animal. No one with any exposure to this subject could responsibly say that the claims do not exist, nor could they say that the physical traces and items touted as evidence do not exist. As such, we should embark on this journey by considering that the phenomenon itself exists, as indicated by its influence on observers and the environment. This is the necessary starting point for individuals seeking the source of the phenomenon. If the Sasquatch exists as a species of North American ape, then this is a story about them. If the Sasquatch exists solely as a product of the human mind, then this can only be a story about us. Let's begin.
So anyways, I like to say it's last call. You don't have to go, but you'll have to restart the video. Usually I ask people kind of what's a one piece of advice they would give to the audience. But in this case, I would like to focus it. What's the one piece of advice you'd give to anyone, watching the show, after picking up the book? What's the next thing they would do if they want to start researching the phenomenon more, or if they want to even venture out into the wild?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if you're wanting to pursue it in terms of being in the field, then, that's the great thing about this particular phenomenon is if you happen to be located in North America, there's a lot of good habitat within a short driving distance of most of the country. For me, beyond getting in the field, I think one of the more impactful things for me, and I know it's impactful for other people, is like, if you can find someone locally, maybe someone that you'd be surprised how many people have had encounters or observations and they've never told anyone because they've never felt like it's so disincentivized and they're so worried about being disbelieved. And most people are deeply concerned about their reputation. But finding someone that you know and trust, or at least someone in the community that you know of and trust, and hearing a firsthand claim, a firsthand observation story is, it's all easy to like dismiss a book or dismiss a podcast or the internet. But when you're face to face with someone, let alone in my experience, like hundreds of people over time that sit down and they tell you about what they saw and the context, or if you can go with them to the place where it occurred, like it's a powerful thing. It's almost transformative. And so that's what I would tell people. Like if you read the book and you're inspired enough to get out in the field and look for yourself, or it's like, don't take my word for it, reach out to other people and get in the field and see what you find and experience, or try to find other witnesses that, local witnesses and things of that nature, someone that you trust. You don't have to dig very hard and very far if you live in the right places to find people. All you have to do is build that trust and build a rapport and let them know that they're not going to be ridiculed or disbelieved summarily. And that's what I would recommend to people. And then once that hook's set, like, good luck. You might devote 20 years.
Very good. Yeah, it's funny. My wife used to tease me about it, but then we were, I think, together long enough because I'll ask people questions like when we were in the UK or something. We were in Scotland, and Scotland had a little after the vote where they were voting if they wanted to break off from the United Kingdom or not. I was asking all the people there about it. She's like, why do you ask them? I'm like, oh, but they would just tell me, right? I'll ask people like, oh, have you witnessed this? Oh, have you done this? And you're surprised what people end up telling you. And they're like, oh, I never would have known, because they won't bring it up on their own. But you ask people tend to tell you things. So that's great advice. So awesome. So thanks so much. So beyond, I have your website and everything, so we can certainly point people there. If there's any other way they want to learn more about you or get in touch, what's the best method for that?
That's probably the best thing. Like, I've got a contact form on the website, and that goes, straight to an email there. Although now I'm learning that, like, when I respond to some of those, they go to the recipient spam folder. So right. I have to send a follow-up email, as what happened in your case.
Exactly.
I'm like, why have these people not gotten back to me? So, but that is probably the best way. I don't really do social media. I mean, the only Bigfoot social media thing I have is a Twitter account, like at Pruitt Bigfoot. And I tweet or X now, whatever they call it, probably like 6 times a year. So if you're expecting like typical social media stuff, I really don't do that. But I'm always happy to talk to people and answer questions. So yeah, you can contact me through the website there, or through Bigfoot and Beyond, the podcast, bigfootandbeyondpodcast.com. There's a contact form there, and that all comes to me as well. So
very cool. Very cool. So thanks so much for coming and spending so much time, going over everything. I know I'm sure a lot of it's old hat for you. But it was fun for me to get to pick your brain a little. And I think it'd be great for people that haven't been exposed to it, or exposed to it as thoroughly, to get a chance to get into it, and hopefully go buy the book. So thanks again, man, so much for coming on. Final round. For those of you who have stuck with us this long, thank you. I hope you enjoyed kind of the change in topics here. And we have a question for you. And the little comment section down there. Let us know what's the most inexplicable thing that's ever happened to you. I would clearly love to hear it. I would listen to it for 3 hours if I had the chance. So drop me that comment. I will drop mine on there as well. And have a great night. Cheers.